On my birthday, my family gave me a thoughtful gift. When I opened it, I found a notice telling me to move out of my own house. I smiled, and a few months later, returned the favor at their wedding. Hi Reddit. I'm a 32-year-old guy, Ronan, and what I'm about to share still feels like it belongs in some low-budget family drama. Not explosive, not theatrical, just strange, slow-burning, quietly messed up. The kind of story that you don't realize is actually going off the rails until you're halfway down the hill with no brakes. It starts with my birthday, or more accurately, the build up to it. But before I get into that, let me back up a bit, because I think this story only makes sense if you understand the people involved and how we got here. I own a house. Nothing massive, just a 2-bedroom place in a quiet suburb about 40 minutes outside the city. I bought it 3 years ago after saving for what felt like forever. I work in IT, not the flashy startup kind, more the quiet corporate kind where you slowly become the person who fixes everything but no one really notices. It's stable. Boring, maybe. But I like boring. I like quiet. And for most of my adult life, I've been just fine with that. My family, on the other hand, they don't really do quiet. My mom, Denise, is the type of person who likes to say she's old school. What that actually means is she likes to control everything and doesn't take well to being told no. Growing up, she ran the house with this weird mix of guilt and performance. If you didn't agree with her, you weren't just wrong, you were ungrateful, disrespectful, selfish. She's the kind of person who remembers every single favor she's ever done for you and brings them up like a receipt whenever it suits her. Then there's my younger sister, Fallon. She's 28, and let's just say, we've always been different. When we were kids, she was the one who needed more attention, more help, more space. That was fine. I didn't mind, really. I was more independent by nature. But as we got older, that dynamic never changed. Fallon always needed, and I always gave. Money for her first car? I helped. Place to crash after a breakup? My couch. Interview clothes? I paid. It wasn't that she asked rudely. Sometimes she didn't even ask. It was just sort of expected that I would be there, that I would help. And to be honest, for a long time, I didn't mind. She's my sister. Fallon's current boyfriend, Milo, has been around for about a year now. He's got this easy smile and this kind of vague, charming way of speaking that makes you feel like he's always selling something, even if he isn't. He gets along with everyone, which is impressive, considering how sharp-edged some of my family can be. My mom loves him, which, in hindsight, should have been a warning sign. Anyway, that's the cast. Now let's talk about the birthday. My birthday is in late March. I wasn't planning anything big. A couple of friends wanted to take me out for dinner, but I was honestly looking forward to a quiet weekend. Maybe get some takeout. Finally start the book that had been sitting on my shelf for 3 months. Not have to think about work. Just a quiet day where I didn't have to solve anyone else's problems. But a week before my birthday, my mom called me. I was at work when she did, so I let it go to voicemail. The message was short, just Denise saying she wanted to do something special for my birthday and that I should call her back to talk details. I knew what that meant. She didn't want to ask if I had plans. She wanted to make the plans and tell me where to show up. Still, I called her back that evening. She sounded unusually upbeat. Told me she missed having the family together and thought it would be nice if we had a little dinner. Just the 4 of them, her, Fallon, Milo, and Aunt Celeste, my dad's sister, who's always been kind of a quiet presence in the background. She said it would be at my house since it was centrally located and made sense. I asked if she was sure everyone was okay with that. She laughed and said, "Of course. It's your birthday. We want to do it your way." That should have been the second red flag. Denise never wants to do things my way. Still, I agreed. It didn't seem worth pushing back over a small dinner. If they wanted to bring pizza and cake and call it a party, fine. It would save me the trouble of making plans. Besides, a part of me thought maybe, just maybe, things would feel normal for once. The day arrived. I spent most of the morning cleaning up the house, setting out a few folding chairs in case there weren't enough seats at the table, and making sure the guest bathroom had clean towels. Around 5 p.m., they all showed up, arms full of food and drinks, chatting like they hadn't seen each other in years, even though I knew Fallon had just been at my mom's house the night before. For the first hour, it was surprisingly pleasant. There was a pepperoni pizza that didn't survive 10 minutes, a veggie one no one touched but pretended to appreciate, and a homemade cake Fallon said she made but I strongly suspected was from the bakery near her apartment. We laughed a little, played a few rounds of this card game Fallon always pushes at gatherings, and everything felt familiar. Tense, sure, but familiar. Like the version of family we used to be when I was 10 and the world felt simpler. Then, sometime after we'd finished eating and just before I was about to start clearing plates, my mom stood up and clapped her hands. "All right," she said, grinning. "Time for the gift." I didn't expect anything, really. Maybe a book. Maybe something from one of those home goods stores that Fallon likes to wander through when she's bored. But then Fallon pulled out this large, carefully wrapped box from the corner of the room and set it in front of me with this big smile like she was holding the answer to all of life's questions. Milo pulled out his phone and started filming. And I should have known. I should have known right then. But I didn't. Not yet. And when I opened that box, that's when everything started to change. Right. So, I'm sitting at the table, cake half eaten, plates still stacked, and this box in front of me. It's wrapped with a lot more effort than anything Fallon has ever given me. The paper was thick, with little golden lines running through it, and the bow on top looked like it had been tied twice just to make sure it sat perfectly in the center. Fallon was standing behind my chair, hands clasped like she was waiting for applause. Milo was still holding his phone up, grinning. My mom had taken a seat across from me, watching with this strange mixture of pride and something else I couldn't name at the time. And Celeste wasn't smiling. She hadn't really spoken much all night, now that I thought about it. She was sipping from a glass and looking everywhere but directly at me. I started peeling the paper off slowly. Something about the moment felt off. I don't know how to explain it except that everyone felt too still, like they were waiting for something. The box underneath was just a plain cardboard one, taped shut. I glanced up, trying to read their expressions, but Fallon just nodded enthusiastically. "Go ahead," she said. "You'll love it. It's really thoughtful." So I opened it. Inside was a blue plastic folder, the kind you might use in school to keep track of homework or loose papers. It looked worn, like it had been handled a lot. I lifted it out and opened it, half expecting to see something like printed family photos, or maybe some old drawings from childhood they dug up as a sentimental gesture. Instead, there was a stack of papers, typed, stapled, and organized like a report. I glanced at the top page. The title read something like Proposed Transition Plan and New Living Arrangement Agreement. I didn't understand. Not right away. I flipped to the next page. There were bullet points, dates, a numbered list. Then my eyes landed on a sentence in the middle of the third paragraph. Effective April 30th, current occupant, Ronan, is expected to vacate the premises to allow for the establishment of shared family residency under the care and management of Denise and Fallon. I read it again, twice, and then I just stared. For a moment, I actually thought I'd misunderstood, that maybe it was a weird joke, a badly written skit for a family game night. Maybe Fallon was going through one of her creative writing phases again. But Milo was still filming, and Fallon was smiling. Denise spoke first. Her voice was light, like she was explaining a recipe. "I know it's a lot to take in," she said, "but we wanted to do this in person so you wouldn't feel blindsided later." I looked up at her slowly. What is this?" Fallon stepped forward and tapped a spot on the folder. "We've been thinking about this for a while," she said, like it was the most natural thing in the world. "It just makes sense. Mom's rent went up, and my lease is ending. Your house has the space. You're always saying how quiet it is here. You don't even use the guest room." Denise added, "And you're hardly ever home during the day. You work so much. It's not like we'd be in your way." It was like listening to a group of people describe a house they found in a catalog and decided to move into, without realizing the house was mine. "This is my home," I said, finally. I wasn't yelling. I wasn't even angry yet. Just confused. You're asking me to leave my own house? No, no, Fallon said quickly. Not asking. We're just suggesting a transition. You could stay with a friend for a while. Or maybe the guy you play chess with at work. I hadn't played chess with anyone since college. Denise reached across the table and rested her hand on the folder. It's not permanent, but we really do believe this would be good for everyone. And we already looked at a few rentals for you, just so the process wouldn't feel overwhelming. That's in the back. She was smiling, genuinely smiling. They had planned this. I looked over at Celeste. She hadn't moved. But when she noticed me staring, she looked away quickly. How long have you been planning this? I asked, not to anyone in particular. Fallon shrugged. A few months. We had to make sure the timeline worked. And I didn't want to interfere with your work deadlines, obviously. Obviously. I didn't say anything else. I didn't argue. I didn't flip the table or storm out. I just sat there, folders still open in my lap, listening to them talk about logistics like I wasn't in the room. Denise started listing the furniture they planned to move in. Her sewing machine, Fallon's bookshelves, Milo's gaming setup. They were laughing now. Fallon leaned into Milo and said something about how open concept houses made everything easier. That's when I smiled. Just a small one. Not sarcastic. Not angry. Just quiet. I closed the folder, stood up slowly, and said, "Thanks for the gift. I'm going to think about it." They didn't even hear me. Fallon was now describing how she wanted to repaint the hallway. She had picked a color. Sage green. I walked upstairs, shut my bedroom door, and sat down on the edge of the bed. And in that silence, something inside me shifted. Not dramatically. Not like a movie. Just quietly. I realized they weren't going to stop. Not until someone made them. And I wasn't angry. Not yet. But I was suddenly very, very focused. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, is that their timing couldn't have been worse. Or maybe better, depending on how you look at it. Because Fallon was getting married in a few months. And I had just decided I'd be attending. And I wouldn't be bringing a gift. I was still sitting on the edge of my bed, holding that blue folder like it might snap in half if I gripped it too tightly. I wasn't hurt, not in the way I might have been years ago. And that surprised me. What I felt wasn't sadness or confusion. It was a quiet, steady click. Like a lock turning. They'd really done it. They'd handed me a plan to move me out of my own home on my birthday, no less, and dressed it up as a thoughtful gesture. And what was worse, they weren't even ashamed. They had celebrated it. Planned it down to the color of the hallway walls. Fallon had stood there, practically bouncing on her heels, talking about the natural light in my kitchen and how it would be perfect for her morning smoothies. Denise had been just as composed. Calm. Almost proud. Like this whole thing was a business deal she'd finally closed. I sat in that room for a long time, the muffled sound of their voices rising and falling downstairs. They weren't even talking about me anymore. Just chatting about what kind of runner rug would go well in the entryway. Eventually, I heard the front door open and close a few times. Laughter. Someone, probably Milo, whistling off-key. A car engine. Then another. And finally, silence. I waited until I was sure they were gone before I went back downstairs. The box was still on the table. The folder still inside. And next to it was a small card, the kind with foil letters that said, "Happy Birthday," on the front. I hadn't noticed it earlier. Inside was a message written in Fallon's neat, round handwriting. "We love you, and we know this is the right next step for all of us. Don't overthink it. Just trust us. Love, Fallon and Mom." I stared at the card for a long time. Then I set it aside, went to the kitchen, made myself tea, and sat at the table in complete silence. And that's when the idea began to form. Not all at once. Just the first thread. Fallon was getting married in 4 months. A garden wedding at this fancy little historic venue 2 towns over. I hadn't been involved in much of the planning, just got the save the date in a group chat and a vague mention of tux fittings sometime in May. But what I did know was that the wedding meant a lot to her. Fallon had always been someone who needed people to see her life as polished, perfect, slightly better than everyone else's. She treated milestones like performances. When she graduated college, she rented a white dress and made us pose for professional photos, caps included, even though the actual ceremony had been virtual and half the family didn't attend. When she started dating Milo, she made an Instagram post titled "The Beginning of Forever" after one coffee date. So this wedding? This wasn't just a celebration for her. This was her moment, her spotlight. And that meant one thing: she couldn't afford for anything to go wrong. So I started taking notes. The next day, I made a private folder on my laptop. I titled it "Home Plans" in case anyone happened to see the tab open. Inside, I created subfolders. One was labeled Documents, where I scanned every single page of the transition plan they gave me. Another called Witness Statements, where I started jotting down memories and observations, everything I could remember from that night, and small things from before. Comments Fallon had made, texts I'd saved, even a voice memo Milo had once left me where he joked about finally getting a space with enough outlets for his stuff. Over the next few weeks, I kept quiet. I didn't bring up the folder. I didn't mention the house. When my mom called, I answered like nothing was wrong. When Fallon texted me a photo of a chandelier she wanted to hang in the living room, I just responded, "Looks nice." They thought I was adjusting. What I was actually doing was watching and gathering. Fallon's wedding planner, Ivy, was an old classmate of mine from high school. We hadn't spoken much in years, but we'd had the same math teacher and used to exchange homework answers over lunch. I messaged her on social media and said I was helping with the wedding. Could we catch up and go over some details? She was happy to meet up. We had coffee 2 days later. Ivy was chatty, friendly. She didn't seem to know anything about what had happened with the house. As far as she knew, everything was on schedule. Ceremony at 3 p.m., reception at 5, buffet dinner, dancing under the lights. She told me Fallon had been a bit intense about the seating chart, but otherwise, things were fine. I didn't push. I just asked small questions, listened, took mental notes. Fallon and Milo were paying for the wedding mostly through a combination of savings and help from my mom. The venue had strict rules about noise, and everything needed to be wrapped up by 10 p.m. sharp. Ivy also let it slip that they were planning a surprise slideshow for the guests, a sweet look back on Fallon and Milo's journey. My sister had asked everyone to submit photos or videos. That's when I knew exactly how this would go. The trap wouldn't be loud. It wouldn't be messy. It would be clean, quiet, almost boring. The kind of revenge you can't point a finger at because, technically, no one did anything wrong. And the best part? They would never see it coming. Not until it was already unfolding in front of every guest they'd invited. Not until the spotlight turned and it wasn't on Fallon anymore. Over the next few months, I played the part they expected. The quiet older brother, the agreeable son, the mild-mannered host who didn't rock the boat. I nodded along when Fallon updated me about the moving schedule, smiled when Mom brought over curtain samples, and even helped Milo carry in a shelf he said they'd just store in the garage for now. They assumed I was folding, giving up. In truth, I was building the final piece of a quiet plan that had started the moment I read that birthday folder. Every evening after work, I logged into a separate account and worked on something I titled Final Cut, Fallon's Forever. I'd gotten the idea during coffee with Ivy, the wedding planner, when she mentioned the couple's surprise slideshow. Fallon wanted something nostalgic and romantic, she'd said. Pictures of the two of them from early dating days, proposal, some family stuff. She said you might send a few. I did, eventually. But I also asked Ivy if I could help edit the final slideshow video. Told her I had a decent setup, a little video editing experience, and that I thought it might ease Fallon's stress if someone close to the family handled it. Ivy had no problem with that. So I got to work. The first half of the video was just what they expected. Photos of Fallon and Milo grinning at picnics, hugging in matching flannel, Milo proposing at the lake. I even added soft music, fading transitions, and that golden tint every wedding slideshow seems to have. Then came the last part. The part no one but me had seen. It started subtly. A picture of my front porch captioned the future. Then a copy of a document, part of the transition plan, with Fallon's notes in the margins. One comment read, "Move my books here ASAP. Need to replace the ugly lamp." Then an audio clip. Fallon's voice, recorded the night of my birthday. "You could stay with a friend for a while. Or maybe the guy you play chess with at work." Followed by Milo's laughter. "We'll turn your office into a gaming room. It'll be sick." Then the final image, my birthday cake. Unlit. The caption, "Happy birthday, Ronan." The whole thing lasted maybe 20 seconds at the end. But it was enough. Enough to pull the curtain back. Now, I didn't want to humiliate Fallon or Milo or even my mom publicly. Not entirely. But I wanted people to see. I wanted them to notice, not just who they pretended to be, but who they actually were when no one was watching. When the day of the wedding arrived, I dressed sharp. Not flashy, just a clean navy suit, pressed shirt, and the watch my grandfather gave me when I graduated college. I arrived early, even before most of the catering crew, and offered to help with anything they needed. Ivy seemed relieved to have a pair of capable hands. I set up folding chairs, adjusted table linens, and even helped string some lights along the tent poles. As relatives began to arrive, I slipped easily into the role I'd played for years, the agreeable older brother, the polite son, the man in the background. I greeted my aunts with hugs, shook hands with cousins I barely knew, and nodded through half-hearted conversations about work, traffic, and how grown-up Fallon looked. Fallon didn't say much to me. When she did, it was clipped and professional, nothing like the syrupy voice she used for her guests. She was busy, posing for the photographer with Milo, rehearsing with the flower girl, checking every detail down to the exact shade of ribbon on the dessert table. She looked like she was staging a royal coronation, not a wedding. Milo mostly hovered behind her, smiling on cue, nodding along. He looked tired. The ceremony itself was lovely, I'll admit. Fallon walked down the aisle on our mother's arm, glowing in her lace-trimmed gown, her hair in waves I knew she'd had done that morning by a stylist from out of town. Milo looked misty-eyed the moment he saw her. He stumbled a little during his vows, which only made the guests coo louder. Everyone clapped as they kissed. Then came the reception. Tables under a large white tent. String lights. Soft music. People sipping punch and picking at tiny appetizers on skewers. I sat with a few cousins and old neighbors. Laughed politely. Ate slowly. Waited. After dinner, when the plates had been cleared and the cake was being wheeled into place, the lights dimmed. Ivy took the mic, beaming. "And now," she said, "a little walk down memory lane for our beautiful couple." Applause rose around the tent. The screen came to life. It began as expected. Childhood photos of Fallon with pigtails and scraped knees. Baby pictures of Milo with cake on his face. Then early dating photos, Fallon and Milo at the lake, bundled up at a fall festival, arms around each other in matching scarves. Everyone chuckled, clapped, sighed. The music swelled. Sentimental. Nostalgic. Then the tone shifted. The screen showed a wide shot of my front porch. The caption read, "The future." Laughter quieted slightly. Next came a copy of a document, projected just long enough to read the headline, "Transition Plan, Bedroom Reassignments." A few notes in the margins were clearly Fallon's handwriting. One read, "Move my books here ASAP. Replace that ugly lamp in the living room." Confused murmurs stirred across the tables. Then an audio clip began. Fallon's voice, "You could stay with a friend for a while. Or maybe the guy you play chess with at work." A brief pause. Then Milo's voice, "We'll turn your office into a gaming room. It'll be sick." The room fell silent. One more photo appeared. My birthday cake. Unlit. Still in its box. Captioned, "Happy birthday, Ronan." No music. Just silence. I was standing off to the side, near the speakers. I saw it all. I also saw the room. Fallon sat completely still, her hands clenched on the tablecloth. Milo's hand gripped his glass so hard I thought it might break. Denise, my mother, blinked slowly, like she wasn't sure what she had just seen. Or perhaps she was hoping she'd imagined it. It ended. The screen went dark. Fallon stood abruptly and leaned toward Ivy, whispering something sharp. Ivy, flustered, hurried over and fiddled with the projector, clicking through settings. Music began again, too loud and too cheerful. She tried to smooth over the awkwardness with a smile. But the damage was done. People noticed. That carefully polished image Fallon had spent years curating had cracked. And behind it wasn't something mysterious or misunderstood. It was entitlement, arrogance, self-interest. And that was enough for that part. But I wasn't done. You see, while all of this had been playing out, the planning, the posing, the surprise move, I had been quietly handling something else. 2 months earlier, I contacted an attorney, not to sue anyone, not to make threats, just to get clear on what I already suspected. The house I was living in, it wasn't my parents'. It never had been. It had been left to me, solely and fully, by my grandfather. I was the legal owner. The deed said so. There was no co-signature, no shared claim. It was mine. I had the title updated, made it official. I waited, watched, listened. Then, the morning after the wedding, while the newlyweds were no doubt sleeping off their big night, I had the locks changed. And later that afternoon, I delivered 3 neatly printed envelopes. One to Fallon, one to Milo, one to Denise. Inside each, a copy of the deed, a list of belongings currently in the house that didn't belong to me, and a simple, polite statement. You have 30 days to remove your belongings. After that, they will be donated. Fallon was the first to respond. She sent a message saying she couldn't believe I'd do this right after her wedding, that I was being spiteful. I didn't respond. Denise called and left a voicemail. Her voice cracked as she said she was heartbroken and didn't know where this was coming from. I didn't return her call either. Milo never responded at all. He just showed up quietly the following week and packed a few boxes with the help of a friend. And they left. No dramatic confrontation. No lawyers. No shouting. Just silence. Fallon still tries to stir the pot sometimes. She posted something a few weeks later, one of those vague quotes about jealousy wearing a smile and how betrayal hurts more when it's family. I didn't comment. I didn't even open it fully. I still have the birthday folder. Not because I need it anymore, but because it reminds me how deeply someone will twist reality when they assume you'll always be the one to bend. It reminds me that keeping the peace isn't always peaceful. That sometimes standing still means letting yourself be pushed over. I don't regret any of it. Now, I live in my home. Quietly. Freely. The rooms feel lighter. The silence doesn't ache. Hi everyone, my name's Gerald, and I need to get this off my chest because honestly, I don't think anyone outside my family would ever understand the kind of treatment I got growing up. I guess I should start at the beginning. I have an older brother, Darren. He's 3 years older than me, and for as long as I can remember, my parents have treated him like some kind of golden child. I'm not exaggerating. Everything he wanted, everything he needed, my parents were there with a credit card or a chauffeur or whatever it took. Me? I was the background, the afterthought, the one they compared to him every single day. It all came to a head the summer I turned 21. Darren had just graduated college, again, thanks to my parents covering every expensive course, tutoring, and even his internships when he couldn't get them on his own. To celebrate, my parents bought him a brand new sports car. Not a nice used car, not something reasonable. A brand new, top-of-the-line sports car that cost more than I'd make in a year if I worked 3 full-time jobs. I walked into the garage that morning, expecting maybe a quiet congratulations for him. But instead, my mom smirked at me and said, "Well, Gerald, you'll never have something like this. Maybe you should focus on something you can get." I froze. It wasn't the first time they'd said something like that, but this time it was different. It wasn't a passing comment or a sigh about my failures. It was deliberate, calculated. They wanted me to feel small. Darren, of course, was oblivious. He hugged them, revved the engine like a little kid, and drove off while I just stood there in silence. I couldn't even speak. The resentment that had been simmering inside me for years suddenly exploded. That night, I packed a small bag. I left without telling anyone where I was going. I wasn't running away to be dramatic. I was leaving to take control of my life. I rented a tiny apartment downtown, got a job in a small tech company, and for the first time, made choices that were purely mine. No one hovering over me, no one comparing me to my brother, no one putting me in some shadow. At first, it was hard. Really hard. I had no safety net, no family to fall back on. I worked late nights, skipped weekends, learned everything I could about investing, business, and strategy. Every insult, every condescending look, every comment about how I'll never be as good as Darren fueled me. I didn't just want to succeed, I wanted to do it on my own terms, far away from them. Years went by. I didn't contact my parents or Darren. I blocked their calls for a while because I realized talking to them just reminded me of who I was supposed to be, according to them. I started building my own small businesses, focusing on tech and real estate, reinvesting every penny I earned. Slowly, methodically, I built something that was entirely mine. Then came last week. I was walking through a private terminal at the airport, ready to board my own jet. A jet I had purchased outright after years of working, investing, and planning, when I saw Darren. Of course, he didn't recognize me at first. He was with my mom, who had been nagging him about some trivial family emergency or whatever excuse she could think of to drag him into their drama-filled orbit. The moment he saw the jet with my name on it, his jaw dropped. His face turned pale. He stepped back as if the plane itself had punched him. And then, like a child who had just lost his favorite toy, he picked up his phone and called my mom. "Mom, how did he get that?" His voice cracked, panicked. He has a jet? He owns it? This isn't possible." My mom, of course, smiled. That smug, satisfied smile she always wore when Darren was shocked or hurt. "Well, Gerald made his choices," she said casually. "Maybe if you stopped expecting things handed to you, you could do the same." Darren hung up, his face white, shaking. And that's when I realized just how far I'd come, and how painfully obvious it must have been to him that I had done everything he had gotten handed to him. But I'd done it myself. After that day at the airport, I didn't contact my parents. I didn't even reach out to Darren. For the first time in years, I just let the shock sit. Watching him flail and realize that I had beaten him at the one thing our parents had always promised he would excel at. It was almost poetic. Almost. But I wasn't satisfied yet. I knew him too well. He wouldn't just accept this quietly. He'd try to claw his way back, and I needed to be ready. I spent the next few weeks carefully planning. Every interaction with my parents had to be deliberate. I wasn't going to call, text, or email. I let them stew in curiosity, frustration, and the invisible walls I had built around myself. And of course, Darren, being the entitled little storm cloud he was, started making inquiries. At first, it was subtle. My mom called once, asking if I could stop by for a family dinner. I ignored it. Then came the texts, all passive-aggressive, sugar-coated statements. "We miss you at home. Darren is asking when you'll come around." I didn't reply. My parents didn't know where I lived. The address I had carefully kept secret was exactly that, a secret. But Darren didn't let it go. He started calling my company. He somehow found out the name of my businesses and tried to contact me through work, asking to meet and talk about family matters. I smiled when I saw the voicemail. The desperation in his voice was unmistakable. Every pause, every stammer, every sharp inhale was pure panic. The same panic I had felt when I was 21, standing in the garage watching him drive away in a car I'd never have. Only now the roles were reversed. I decided it was time to escalate. Not by replying, "Oh no," that would have been too obvious, but by showing my success in ways that couldn't be ignored. I started arranging small, public appearances, charity galas, tech conferences, openings for properties I had developed. Every time I appeared, photographs surfaced online, tagged with my name and my businesses. Darren, always obsessed with competition, noticed immediately. He called my mom again, voice trembling. "Mom, why is he at all these events? He's everywhere. How does he even have time? How is he?" The questions trailed off. She interrupted him, chuckling in that way that made her sound both amused and superior. "Darren, Gerald made choices," she said. "You always had the option to make your own, but you wanted everything handed to you. Maybe someday you'll understand that, but for now, just enjoy watching him thrive." He hung up, face red, hands shaking, and I watched from my side of the city, knowing exactly what he felt. That gnawing panic, that realization that life wasn't going to spoon-feed him anymore. That control had shifted entirely. But I wasn't done. No, this was just the beginning. I started planning a move that would cement my independence and simultaneously crush the last remnants of their arrogance. The big reveal had to be impossible to ignore. It had to be public enough that they would have no choice but to face it, yet intimate enough that it would sting personally. It all started with the idea of a property auction. Over the past few years, I had quietly invested in a number of high-end properties. Some I flipped, some I rented, some I held on to because the value was climbing steadily. One of them was an enormous estate in the city's wealthiest district, a place that had belonged to a well-known family, restored and redeveloped, and I had purchased it in secret. I invited my parents and Darren, anonymously at first, to what I called a private viewing for potential investors. I knew Darren wouldn't be able to resist the curiosity, and my parents, ever so desperate to show off their control, agreed to tag along. They didn't know whose event it was. They didn't know that every person they would see inside the estate, every valet, every staff member, and every decorative flourish was mine. The day of the viewing, I arrived early. Standing in the grand foyer, watching the sun hit the marble floors just right, I felt a calmness I had never experienced with my family around. The house was perfect, not ostentatious, but elegant, impressive, and unmistakably expensive. I had arranged it to feel lived in, but aspirational, the kind of property that screamed success without shouting it. And then I saw them. Darren, followed by my mom, walking down the long driveway. I stayed in the shadows at first, letting them wander, letting their eyes widen as they slowly began to understand the magnitude of what they were seeing. They walked through the entrance, and I heard Darren mutter under his breath, This can't be real." My mom's expression shifted from curiosity to polite intrigue, masking the fact that her pride in his entitlement was being slowly replaced with shock. They wandered through the rooms, admiring the fixtures, the art, the carefully curated furniture. And then they came into the main hall, where I finally revealed myself. I stepped out of the shadows, calm, collected, dressed simply but elegantly, the kind of presence that immediately drew attention without needing to speak. Darren froze. His eyes went wide. You own this?" he asked, barely audible, as though speaking louder might make it vanish. I nodded. "Every inch, every brick, every detail, all mine." My mom's smile faltered. She always had that ability to recover quickly, to mask shock with an expression of superiority, but this time it didn't stick. Her hands trembled slightly, and I could see the calculation running through her head. How had I built this? How had I managed this without their guidance, without their help, without their credit cards? Darren didn't even wait for an answer. He turned to her, voice shaking, almost breaking. "Mom, how did he do this? How is this even possible?" I let the silence linger, savoring the moment. The truth was simple: patience, strategy, and refusing to let them define me. But Darren and my parents didn't need to hear the explanation. The image, the presence, the reality of it all. It was enough to upend their expectations, to leave them questioning every decision they had ever made, and to make Darren feel the first real taste of being powerless in his own family. And yet, as I watched them standing there, I realized something important. The satisfaction I expected, the full, visceral thrill of seeing them humbled, wasn't complete. No, the real story wasn't finished yet. There was still one move left, one that would guarantee that my victory was absolute, one that would finally put every single entitled expectation they had in its proper place. But making that move meant stepping fully into the spotlight, orchestrating a plan that was risky, delicate, and perfect. It meant letting them see not just my success, but the truth about who I had become and how completely independent I was from the life they had tried to control me with. After that first encounter at the estate, I retreated back into my life. I didn't call or message them. I didn't even let Darren know I had seen the effect my presence had on him. That would have been too easy for him to dismiss. No, I wanted to make sure the next move landed perfectly, with maximum impact. I spent the next 2 months quietly building what I now consider the masterstroke of my strategy: the launch of my own private investment fund. Not just any fund, but a high-profile, invitation-only venture that would attract wealthy clients, entrepreneurs, and media attention. Every step of the process was calculated. I wanted this to be public enough that my success could no longer be ignored, but personal enough that my parents and Darren would feel the sting of exclusion firsthand. During this period, I also refined my interactions with Darren. Whenever I received inquiries through mutual contacts, I replied vaguely, always polite, never revealing more than necessary. I could sense his desperation growing. He started showing up at events I knew he couldn't get into legitimately, trying to bump into me at charity functions or networking dinners. My parents, of course, tagged along with him sometimes, looking to assert some semblance of control. But by now, I had grown into a version of myself they had never seen. Confident, composed, and untouchable in ways that left them unsure of how to react. One evening, about a week before the official launch of my fund, I decided to invite my parents to dinner. Not at a restaurant, not in public, at my penthouse. I kept it casual in tone, almost offhand, in a message that made it sound like it was nothing out of the ordinary. They accepted immediately, probably assuming that it was another opportunity to parade Darren's supposed superiority or to remind me that I was still under their thumb in some way. The night of the dinner, I had arranged everything with meticulous care. My penthouse was elegantly understated. Expensive, yes, but not gaudy. The table was set for three: me, my mother, and my father. Darren, of course, was nowhere near the apartment yet. He wasn't invited. That would come later. They arrived on time, as punctuality seemed to be one of the few traits they actually valued. My mother's eyes widened slightly when she stepped into the living room. I could see her taking in the space, the artwork, the furniture, the subtle displays of wealth and taste, and trying to reconcile it with the image of the obedient, struggling Gerald they had carried around in their heads for years. "Wow," she murmured. "This is impressive." I smiled politely, guiding them to the dining area. "Thank you. I've put a lot of time into making it my own." Dinner was quiet at first, formal. My parents exchanged glances, subtle signs of the confusion and frustration simmering beneath the surface. My father kept trying to steer the conversation toward Darren, asking questions about his latest ventures, subtly reminding me of my place as the younger, less successful sibling. I let it slide, listening, nodding, and occasionally commenting, all the while plotting my next move. After the main course, I stood and excused myself for a moment. When I returned, I had something in my hand, a small envelope. I placed it on the table in front of my mother. Her brows furrowed. "What's this?" she asked, reaching for it. I let the silence stretch. "Open it," I said calmly. Inside was an invitation. A sleek, professionally printed card for the launch of my investment fund, scheduled for the coming week. The names of several high-profile attendees were listed, people I knew my parents would recognize immediately. They would understand, the moment they read the list, that I was operating in a sphere far above the one they had imagined for me, or for Darren. My mother's hand shook slightly as she passed it to my father. I watched their expressions closely, taking in the subtle mix of disbelief, panic, and barely controlled anger. "You're running this yourself?" my father asked finally, his voice low. "All of it," I nodded. "Every bit. I've been working toward this for years. I've built my own team, sourced my own investors, and planned every detail myself. I wanted you to see it before the public launch." My mother's eyes flicked toward me, and for a moment, I thought I saw the faintest hint of respect. Then it vanished, replaced by something colder, calculating, almost fearful. "And Darren?" she asked cautiously, her tone trying to regain some sense of authority. "He wasn't invited," I said simply. "This is my achievement, my event. There's no reason for him to be part of it." The tension in the room was palpable. My parents, used to controlling every narrative in the family, were suddenly confronted with the reality that there was a part of my life they had no access to, no influence over. They looked at each other, silently debating what to say next, how to regain some semblance of dominance. But it was too late. I had already taken that power away from them. The next few days were a blur of planning and anticipation. I focused on every detail of the launch, making sure the media coverage would be flawless and that Darren and my parents, if they tried to follow, would see exactly what they had missed. I even arranged for a few subtle hints to reach mutual acquaintances, friends of Darren, minor contacts my parents liked to boast about, to mention the scale of my work, the sophistication of the launch, and the caliber of people attending. On the day of the launch, I arrived early, walking through the space I had meticulously prepared. The room was elegant, modern, yet approachable, filled with the right balance of clients, press, and partners. Every person in the room was someone who could recognize my achievements and, if they spoke to Darren or my parents later, reinforce the narrative I was carefully constructing. Then came the moment I had been waiting for. my parents arrived, escorted by a mutual acquaintance who had agreed to guide them to the event. They entered, confident at first, expecting to find a small, underwhelming gathering. But their expressions changed immediately as they took in the scene. The room was buzzing, cameras capturing moments, clients networking, and in the center, I stood, calm, collected, and in complete control of the entire operation. Darren, of course, eventually arrived, having heard about the event through a mutual contact. I didn't let him in immediately. Instead, I watched from a distance as he approached, his face pale, his steps hesitant. He recognized immediately that this wasn't just another gathering. It was a statement, a declaration of independence and achievement that he could never replicate without starting from scratch. When he finally saw me, standing confidently amidst the buzz of conversation, introductions, and deals, his entire demeanor shifted. His usual smirk, the one that had plagued me for years, was gone. His eyes widened, and his lips parted in disbelief. For a moment, I could almost hear the thoughts racing through his mind. How had I done this? How could he have missed it? How could his parents have let this happen? And in that exact moment, I realized something profound. The real power wasn't just in the jet, the estate, or the investments. It was in the control I had over my own narrative, the life I had built without them, and the fact that they were witnessing it unravel before their very eyes. I was standing at the edge of the final act, the one that would cement everything I had worked for, that would ensure my parents and Darren understood, once and for all, that I had not just escaped their favoritism, but had utterly outmaneuvered it. Then Darren did something that changed everything. He tried to interrupt me. He didn't barge in like a cartoon villain. He didn't scream or accuse me in front of everyone the way I'd pictured in some long, petty fantasy. He approached like a man trying to salvage what dignity he had left, careful, measured, as if politeness could buy him back everything his parents and life had always handed him on a silver platter. He came up behind me while I was speaking with a prospective investor and said, quiet enough so only I could hear, "Gerald, can we talk?" Privately, I felt the muscles in my neck tighten. The whole room seemed to dim around the two of us. The investor I was speaking with gave a polite nod and drifted away, leaving us an island of murmurs and clinking glasses. Darren's hand trembled when he reached for my arm. That tremor was not something I'd seen from him before. He'd always been theatrical, never nervous. Seeing him like that told me how badly he'd misread everything. "Not now," I said, and my tone was softer than I'd intended. "This is not the place." He swallowed. "It's important. Please, just 5 minutes. For the family." I looked at him, really looked. The entitlement I'd grown up under was still there in the set of his jaw, but beneath it was raw panic. His eyes landed on my suit, on the salving sheen of the event, the cameras. "Gerald," he said again. "Mom called. She's worried. She wants us to talk about finances. About the company. She thinks something's wrong." He used the word company, and my skin went cold for a second. I had anticipated this. My parents were the sort who would manufacture crises to force reconciliation, an illness, a business problem, any manufactured drama to pull me back into their orbit where they could control the narrative again. I had no intention of walking back into that world. "Send her my schedule," I said plainly. "We'll set something for next week. I'm tied up tonight." He blinked like that answer had somehow surprised him. "She's already here," he confessed, voice dropping to a whisper. "She's in the VIP lounge. She wants to talk now. She says it's urgent." The laugh that escaped me was small and sharp. "Of course she does." I could have left it there. I could have kept the image of my parents watching from the other room, puzzled and defeated, and let that be the last time they saw me on shaky ground. But something else moved under my skin, the same careful, patient thing that had gotten me this far. There was a final maneuver I'd been saving for the exact convergence of ego, expectation, and stage. "Fine," I said. 5 minutes. We walked through the crowd, and my mother rose as we approached, a practiced smile pasted in place. She looked radiant in the way my mother wore her confidence. Expensive, rehearsed, the smile of someone who'd never had to account for her choices. My father stood slightly behind her, arms folded as if this entire evening were another performance. "Gerald," she said, voice effortlessly warm. "What a surprise. We were just—" She faltered, the edge of her composure cracking when she saw my face. "Is everything all right?" I kept my expression neutral. Everything is fine. I wanted to give you both a minute before the formal part of the night. Oh, her smile was thin. Is this about Darren? He seemed so upset when he arrived. Darren was not trying to hide his agitation. He hovered near us like a man waiting for a verdict. We just want to understand what this is about, he said. I mean, you didn't tell us anything. We found out from people. The murmurs in the room kept going, small, curious ripples, but the center of gravity had tightened to us. I turned slightly, scanning the crowd. Cameras angled this way and that. A few journalists I knew were taking notes. Perfect. Before I say anything, I told them, I'd like to show you something. I nodded to a member of my team, who signaled to the audiovisual staff. The lights dimmed fractionally. A flat screen near the stage flickered and then filled with an image. The old family company logo, the one Mom had polished up and used at every charity brunch, every family event email, every name drop. My mother's smile thinned completely. What is that? On screen, a presentation began, clean, unflinching. Charts. Simple facts. No flourish. Just data and documents. The kind of unglamorous proof lawyers and accountants love. It began with a headline that I'd composed myself. A strategic acquisition. Harrington Holdings. Darren's laugh was a nervous bark. You bought Harrington? He blurted. You can't. You can verify it yourself, I said. I watched his face as the slide changed to show the press release. My fund had, earlier that month, closed on a controlling stake in Harrington Holdings. The slide showed transaction dates, closing figures, and a list of immediate changes to the board. The next slide displayed one name prominently, Gerald K. Mercer, Executive Chair, Interim. The room shifted like a school of fish. Conversations frayed, then stuttered into silence. My mother pressed her hand to her chest, as if to steady a tremor. My father's face went an ashy shade I hadn't seen since I'd turned down their offer of a cushioned life. Darren looked like someone watching their favorite house get dismantled out the window. You what? He said, voice thin. You just. How did you even? You never asked, I said. You never tried. My mother's jaw worked. She stepped forward, the smile gone. Gerald, that company has been in our family for generations. We never. It's not the same company you remember, I said. They needed capital. They needed a modern strategy. I offered it. I paid fair market value. I did not raid the family. I did not hide anything. I presented a plan to the board, and they accepted it. Her face was a mask of fury folded into shame. You bought them out. From us. Without even telling us. That is. It's business, I said. And it's done. Behind my mother something shifted, disbelief, then a thin rising panic she tried desperately to hide. She reached into her purse, hands shaking, and pulled out her phone. Darren saw it, and for an instant he moved toward her as if to stop her from dialing. He didn't. He had already learned, painfully, that when his mother panicked, his entitled world eroded even faster. My mother's fingers hovered over the screen. Then she looked at me with something like wounded outrage. Why? She asked, voice low but furious. Why would you do this? We are family. We would have. You never asked me to be family in the way you meant it, I answered. You asked me to be what you needed, obedient, small, grateful. I chose differently. The auditorium felt smaller. The air tasted metallic. I could see the press in the back lean in, the subtle posture of people who had smelled a story. The board members I'd invited gave each other a discreet, pleased look. This was worse for them than for me. This was the first time in a long time that the people who thought they could arrange the world had been rearranged. Darren went pale, then red, like a bad sunburn blooming from the inside out. You can't, he tried to laugh it off. You can't just, what are you going to do? Replace us? Close the family philanthropy? Throw us out? I had planned for him to say that. I had phrased my next move to land precisely on his worst fears. My voice was steady as I explained the next slide, the one that made my mother sway backwards, made the grip on her phone tighten so hard her knuckles whitened. As part of the restructuring, I said, we are aligning Harrington with contemporary governance practices. That includes auditing legacy contracts, reassessing leadership roles, and, where necessary, changing titles and responsibilities. We will be inviting new leadership to consult on operational updates. I let the phrase hang. It was euphemistic legalese meant to bury the pole in soft foam, but the point was clear. The people who had treated Harrington like a family trophy were about to find themselves with less influence than they had always assumed. I watched their faces as the implication landed. My mother opened her mouth, then closed it. My father's expression was gone, replaced by a hunted look I recognized like an old scar. Darren's mouth trembled. "You can't do this," he said finally. You're not one of them. You're not." "I am," I said. "I am one of them enough to know how to fix it." That was the moment the room flurried into motion. Phones came out. People whispered. A reporter at the far end of the room raised a hand and asked a question that made my stomach lurch with the kind of delicious anxiety I'd worked years to cultivate. "Will there be layoffs?" she asked, voice professional, sharp. I answered calmly, because I had already rehearsed how this would sound. "We are conducting an assessment. Any decisions will be made to ensure the long-term viability of the company. We owe that to our employees and our investors." That was the public line. The private line was simpler. I had just put the people who had used me as a punching bag in a position where they might lose not just prestige, but actual power and income. The thought of that, of them forced to reckon with consequences they had always outsourced, felt like settling an old debt. Darren's face crumpled, like someone who'd realized he'd been living in a house of cards that another person had been quietly removing the glue from. He looked at my parents, pleading. "Tell them to stop," he begged. "Tell them that this is too much. Gerald, don't, please." My mother's hand trembled over the phone. For the first time since I'd left at 21, I saw my mother unsure. She looked at the crowd, at the cameras, at the board members who'd accepted the offer I'd placed on the table. And then, finally, she looked at me. "Gerald," she said, voice brittle. "This is cruel." I let my smile be small and unrepentant. "This is business," I said again. "And this is how you taught me to play." Darren lunged forward then, not an angry, shouting lunge, but something closer to a child's frantic grab for a cherished toy. He reached for my sleeve, fingers curling around fabric like desperate roots. "You can't do this to us," he hissed. "You can't take our company away from us. You're not one of them." I looked down at his hand on me and felt, honestly, none of the pity I knew other people would expect I might feel. I felt the trace memory of every small humiliation, every stinging sentence about how I would never have what Darren had, every time a parent had used a lifetime's financial cushion as a weapon instead of support. The hand closed and then fell away as my team members signaled that the press wanted a statement. Cameras swung in. The audience leaned forward. "Enough," I said, voice low but carrying. "This conversation can continue privately. For now, if you'd like, I can introduce you to the board members. They'll be meeting after the event." Darren staggered back, like I'd struck him. He clutched at the arm of a nearby sponsor, and then retreated, eyes wild with the kind of fear that comes not from physical danger, but from the sudden loss of a script you'd long assumed would carry you through life. My parents followed him with blank faces, their composure in tatters. They left the room not with the thunder of outrage, but with a brittle silence that spoke louder than any accusation. As they walked away, my mother's phone slipped from her hand and clattered to the floor, screen flashing with an incoming call from a family lawyer. She didn't answer it. She didn't look back. The applause that followed my brief statement felt thin to me, polite, rehearsed. People clapped because a good story had unfolded and cameras had captured it. But within that thin sound was something that had never existed when I was a kid, respect that I'd earned. Cold, quiet, deliberate respect. Later, in the hush that follows a storm that hasn't yet broken, Darren found me in a quiet corner. He looked like a man who'd had every certainty removed and had been told to plan his life anew. He was smaller than I remembered, which I suppose made sense. Privilege does not strengthen muscles. "You think you're better than us now?" he asked, not really a question. I stared at him for a long moment. There was a temptation to speak the things I'd rehearsed for years, accumulate every cutting truth about how he'd had things given to him and squandered them. There was also a deeper, quieter satisfaction in watching him arrive at his own understanding. "No," I said finally. "Better isn't the word. Different. Responsible." He laughed, a short, ugly sound. "You want to run the company? Take it away from us? What will you do? Change our charity, sell the house? Take everything." I watched him as though he was finally noticing the furniture for himself. "I don't need to take everything to make a point," I said. "I just need to show that the life you were handed can be rebuilt by someone who was told they'd never have it. That's all." His face contorted like he was trying to translate a foreign language. And Mom? Dad? They'll just accept it. He asked it like a child asking if monsters are real. The answer is never simple. But before I could muster anything closer to compassion, another figure appeared between us. My mother, flanked now by the family lawyer she'd finally raised, her expression a mask again, but with eyes that didn't quite meet mine. "You will regret this," she said, calm as a winter lake. "We will make sure of it." There was menace in the words, threat, legacy, the clumsy confidence of people who believe money and lawyers can reclaim anything. It was almost laughable, except for the pulse of real danger beneath it. She turned to leave, then paused, and for 1 second her shoulders sagged with something like the weight of a parent worried for a son. "Darren," she said quietly, not even looking at him. "Help him. Talk to him. Make him understand." Darren's face crumpled in a way I had seen only in old photos, the one where he's 3 years old and on the receiving end of the family's coddling. He moved then, hands fumbling, and wrapped his arms around our mother in a clumsy, almost apologetic hug. It looked like theater, like the kind of performance they had perfected for their social circle. Only this time the stage had shifted beneath them. As they left the event, shepherded by acquaintances and lawyers and people who smelled drama and money, I felt that impossible thrum of triumph and apprehension buzzing under my ribs. I had pulled a public lever that exposed the whole family for what it was: imperfect, vulnerable, capable of losing things they'd treated as immutable. But revenge, as I had learned in the years I spent building this life, is never a single act. You can buy a company, announce restructuring, and coax the ground from under a family's confidence, but consequences ripple in ways you cannot always predict. There were phone calls already underway. There would be angry letters. There would be quiet sabotage, whispers among board members who resented change. There would be late-night meetings and maybe threats thinly veiled as legal advice. And there, in the hallway outside the event, with my mother's lawyer's voice still ringing in the air and Darren's small, frightened face burned into my memory, I realized that the story was not over. I had struck a blow, an effective one, but the fight had only shifted arenas. As they disappeared down the corridor, my phone buzzed with a name I had not expected to see. A former business partner who had promised loyalty years ago, but also promised nothing. Then a message from one of the Harrington executives, a terse, urgent line: "Meet me tomorrow morning." My calendar filled with meetings that could salvage or sink the move I'd made. I took a breath. The lights of the city were beginning to hatch into night beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. The plane was still at the hangar, waiting. The estate would be ready for handover soon. The fund had commitments. My choices had consequences. The next morning, I woke early and went straight to my office. The city was just beginning to stir, the streets below dotted with taxis, joggers, and early commuters. But up here, in the calm of my penthouse-turned headquarters, it felt like a world apart. I had prepared for this moment for years. Every calculation, every risk, every sleepless night had been about building not just wealth, but absolute leverage. First on the agenda was Harrington Holdings. The executive who had sent the message yesterday was waiting for me in the boardroom. I walked in and immediately got to business. There were contracts to finalize, appointments to confirm, and operational decisions to make. The executives were professional, competent, and they hadn't known me as the kid my parents treated like a shadow. They treated me with respect, listened, and executed decisions without questioning my authority. That was new. That was powerful. Meanwhile, word had reached my parents quickly. My mother had already sent several frantic texts to Darren, all variations on the same theme. "You need to fix this. He cannot just take what belongs to us. Call him. Convince him. Do not let this stand." Darren, desperate as ever, tried. He called me, his voice trembling with panic, begging for explanations, pleading for compromises. I did not answer. I had nothing to explain. Every move I had made had been perfectly legal, completely justified, and entirely mine. By mid-morning, the first press inquiries arrived. Local business news picked up the acquisition story, and within hours, the story had gone national. Headlines highlighted the boldness of the move. Young entrepreneur acquires century-old family company. From background to boardroom, Gerald Mercer's rise. I watched Darren's mother, my mother, appear on video calls in hushed tones with their lawyers and family friends, trying to figure out how to undo what had already been done. The reality for them was brutal. My parents had always believed money and social status gave them control over the world, and certainly over me. But all that control evaporated the moment I built something independently of them. Their privilege, their network, their connections were no match for strategy, patience, and years of hard work. By late afternoon, Darren made a final, desperate attempt. He came to my penthouse unannounced, suit ill-fitting and hair unkempt, a mixture of fear and fury written across his face. My mother and father were not with him, but he had clearly spoken to them beforehand. He expected me to feel intimidated, maybe guilty, maybe soft enough to make concessions. He walked into the living room, stared at me, and said, almost on a whisper, "Gerald, please. You can't just take everything from us. Mom, Dad, they'll ruin you if you don't reverse this." I finally looked at him without hesitation. "Darren, everything you think I took from you is yours only in your imagination. I didn't take anything. I built my life. You squandered every opportunity handed to you. I followed the same world, but I did it differently. I earned this. You and my parents. Well, you're just realizing that life isn't a series of gifts." He staggered back, his face pale. His mouth moved, searching for words, but none came. I could see it, the exact moment when entitlement crumbles under reality. The boy who had always been my parents' pride, the one who had been given cars, credit cards, and every chance imaginable, had nothing to stand on now. And I pressed the advantage. I pulled out a document, legal, clean, undeniable, detailing the changes in Harrington's leadership. Every board member, every operational shift, every decision that reduced my parents' influence was spelled out. "This," I said, laying it on the coffee table, "is the new structure. My authority is final. Any attempts to interfere will be met with legal action. You are welcome to watch, but you will not control." Darren's knees buckled slightly. "Mom, Dad, they can do nothing," I interrupted. "You should have realized that the day I left, the day I decided to live my life on my own terms. You raised me to be smaller than Darren, but I refused. I didn't just refuse your control, I outgrew it entirely. And now, you're powerless. Every call you make, every demand, every threat, it has no weight here. None." For the first time, he cried. Not the soft, fleeting tears of a child, but the raw, unfiltered despair of someone who finally recognizes that their world has ended. My parents, watching from a distance, were furious, fuming at my audacity, my independence, my complete refusal to let them manipulate me. But there was nothing they could do. The law, the contracts, the investors, they all backed me. My parents had no recourse. Their reputation could be scratched, but their control was gone. The aftermath was slow but decisive. Harrington Holdings flourished under my guidance. I maintained the charitable efforts, the staff, the legacy of the company, but on my terms, not theirs. My parents attempted public smears, whispered threats, and even subtle sabotage through social networks, but it all failed. Each move they made was countered with legal precision, strategy, and the quiet patience I had honed over 5 years of independence. Darren, meanwhile, retreated into a shadow of the person he had been. The boy who had always been handed life now realized he would have to work, and I mean truly work, for anything he wanted. But by that point, the gap between us was unbridgeable. He had lost not only my respect, but the platform that had once been guaranteed to him. My parents tried to reach out after a few months, attempting to charm me with false apologies, veiled offers of reconciliation, or promises of recognition. Every attempt was met with polite refusal. I did not forgive them. I did not normalize their behavior. They had spent decades creating a narrative where my life was to be theirs to mold, and I had spent 5 years dismantling it piece by piece. There was no going back, and I made sure they understood that. Today, my life is steady, successful, and mine entirely. The private jet still waits at the hangar. The penthouse overlooks the city. Harrington Holdings thrives under my leadership, and every day I wake knowing that I have done what my parents and Darren never could, built a life on my own terms, free from manipulation, entitlement, and favoritism. Darren occasionally calls or texts. I ignore him. My parents send messages, attempt subtle influence, try to guilt or charm, but the dynamic is irreversibly reversed. I am no longer the background character in their story. I am the one writing the narrative now. And the most satisfying part? They know it. Every time they see a headline, every time they hear about my next move, they remember that smirk in the garage when I was told, "You'll never have that." And now, they know the truth. I didn't just have it. I surpassed it. Entirely. The family they tried to control is gone, reshaped entirely by the one they underestimated, the quiet, patient, methodical kid they tried to keep in the shadows. And in the end, they are powerless spectators to the life I built from scratch, while Darren and my parents remain reminders of entitlement left unchecked, crushed by their own inability to understand effort, strategy, and consequence. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments. If you like this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content like this. When I lost my job, my family didn't offer support. They threw a party without me and toasted to finally cutting off the extra baggage. My sister even posted, "Karma works fast." I stayed quiet, just watched from a distance. That was 3 years ago. Last week, I made a move they never saw coming. Now they're blowing up my phone, begging, "You can't do this to us." Hi Reddit. I'm Lucian, a 40-year-old man who spent most of his life feeling like the family benchwarmer, useful when needed, invisible otherwise. I wasn't the kind of person who made waves. I was the quiet one at gatherings, the one who stayed late to help clean up, the one who was always too sensitive or too serious whenever I questioned how I was treated. You know the type. There's one in almost every family. But let me back up and give some context. I think that's the only way this story will make sense. I grew up in a fairly traditional household. My father, Leonard, was a stern man, not cruel exactly, but rigid and old-fashioned. He believed in roles. Men work, women raise kids, boys don't cry, and anything artistic was a hobby, not a job. He ran a small auto shop in town and expected both his children to either join the business or marry into something respectable. My mother, Corinne, was the sort of woman who never liked things that made her uncomfortable. That included conflict, emotional vulnerability, or anything that didn't fit into her perfectly framed photo albums. On the surface, she was sweet, always smiling for neighbors, always bringing a pie to the church potluck. But behind closed doors, her approval was conditional. You either made her proud or you made her nervous, and if it was the latter, she distanced herself. Then there was Callie, my younger sister, 3 years younger, but somehow always treated like the older one. She had a way of making everyone notice her, even in a room full of people. She was loud, funny, fashionable, and clever in the sort of way that makes adults chuckle and excuse her behavior with, "Oh, that's just Callie." She tested boundaries constantly but rarely faced consequences. If I had so much as raised my voice, I'd be sent to my room. If Callie skipped curfew, it became a story my parents told at parties with a smile. I didn't resent her not back then. I just assumed that was how families worked. Some kids shine brighter, and the rest of us try to make ourselves useful in the corners. I moved out as soon as I could. I saved up through community college, worked retail jobs, and eventually found my way into digital marketing. It was a good fit. I liked the structure of it, the creativity paired with logic. Numbers made sense to me in ways people sometimes didn't. Over time, I worked my way up to a mid-level strategist role at a marketing firm about 2 hours from my hometown. I had a small apartment, a quiet routine, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was doing something right. I wasn't wealthy by any means, but I was stable. I sent cards on birthdays. I visited during the holidays, even when it meant sleeping on the couch while Callie took the guest room. I helped Dad set up a website for the auto shop. I didn't ask for much, and honestly, I didn't expect much either. I had accepted that I'd never be the favorite. I was okay with that. Then came 2021. The firm I worked for started hemorrhaging clients during the early months of the pandemic. Everyone was pulling back, cutting budgets, freezing campaigns. I saw the writing on the wall, but I still hoped we'd make it through. I was one of the last to be laid off in the first big round. They said it wasn't personal, and maybe it wasn't. But it felt personal. That job wasn't just a paycheck. It was my identity. It was the one place I felt like I belonged, like I had something to offer. Losing it knocked the wind out of me. For 2 weeks, I told no one. I ate cheap meals, updated my resume, applied for everything remotely related to marketing, even internships just to stay in the game. I didn't want pity, but I thought, maybe, just maybe, if I told my family, they'd surprise me. Maybe they'd offer some encouragement, a kind word, a sliver of understanding. I called my mom first. I still remember the silence on the other end of the line after I told her. Then she said, "Well, I suppose you'll have to start thinking about something more dependable now." That was it. Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "How are you feeling?" Just a practical, emotionless assessment, as if I had told her I'd spilled coffee on a carpet she never liked anyway. Then she asked if I had time to help her clean out the storage room, now that I was between things. I forced a laugh and said I'd think about it. I hung up feeling smaller than I had in years. I didn't bother calling my dad. Callie found out through mom. I know this because I saw her Instagram post later that week. A selfie of her at some brunch spot, all dressed up, captioned, "Some of us keep rising while others just drift." I wanted to believe it wasn't about me. But Callie had a knack for throwing shade that only made sense if you knew the context. And I knew. I should have been prepared for what happened next, but I wasn't. 2 weeks after I told my mom, my cousin Brent accidentally tagged me in a picture from a family gathering. I stared at it for a long time, trying to make sense of it. There they were, my parents, Callie, a few uncles and aunts, sitting around the backyard table with food and decorations and candles. There was even a banner in the background. It said, "Here's to fresh starts." At first, I thought maybe it was someone's birthday I forgot, or an anniversary. But the comments under the photo told a different story. Out with the old energy. Some people just weigh you down. So proud of you guys. Finally, some peace in the family. And then I saw it. Callie had posted a short video clip of everyone raising glasses together. The audio was hard to make out, but someone in the background clearly said, "To finally cutting off the extra baggage." Her caption? "Karma works fast." That was the moment something in me shifted. Not anger, not even sadness, just something deeper, a kind of clarity, a confirmation of something I had always suspected, but never wanted to fully admit. They didn't just tolerate me less. They saw me as expendable. So I went quiet. I stopped calling. I stopped checking in. I stopped replying to holiday group texts. I didn't block anyone. I wanted them to see I was still alive, just no longer interested in playing my old role. And in that silence, I started building. Quietly. Methodically. Alone. 3 years passed. They didn't reach out, not really. Just the occasional, "Hope you're well" message from my aunt or a birthday thumbs up from Callie. Then, last month I made a move they never expected. Something that would affect them all. My phone started ringing again for the first time in years. It was a Wednesday morning when it began. I remember because I had just finished a meeting with a new client, a logistics company that needed help overhauling their entire digital presence. It had gone well, and I was in a good headspace. Calm. Focused. Then my phone buzzed. Missed call, Mom, then again. Missed call, Callie, and then a text from my father, which nearly made me laugh aloud, not because it was funny, but because it was so out of character, it felt like it belonged in a movie. "Lucian, we need to talk. This isn't something we should be handling through silence." Silence. That word. After 3 years of it, they suddenly wanted conversation. I didn't respond. I just watched. An hour later, my Aunt May messaged me. She was always the most neutral one in the family, not unkind, just disconnected. Her message was simple. "Hey, sweetie. Just wondering if you're okay? Things seem tense over there." Still, I said nothing. Because they didn't know what I'd done. Not fully. But something had happened. They were feeling it. And they were nervous. Let me explain how we got there. When I lost my job, I had very little in savings. I'd lived responsibly, but I hadn't prepared for long-term unemployment. So, I tightened everything. I moved into a smaller apartment, sold off some non-essentials, got freelance work where I could. It was a grind, but I learned fast. More importantly, I learned about people, how they search for things, what they trust, what makes them click or buy. I didn't just return to digital marketing. I began building something of my own. At first, it was just a blog, then a small agency, then a digital platform focused on helping small, local businesses transition online. It started with just 3 clients, 2 of whom were friends from college. But I treated them like they were Fortune 500. I gave them everything I had: analytics, ad targeting, rebranding, SEO strategies tailored like fine suits. Word spread. Slowly, but it did. I hired freelancers, then part-time staff. Then, 2 years in, we landed a statewide contract through a chain of independently owned craft stores looking to build an e-commerce presence. That was the turning point. From there, it grew. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Remember my father's auto shop? It had been struggling for years. Even back when I was a teen, he refused to modernize anything. No online booking, no website, no social media. He said word of mouth was enough. When I built him a simple homepage years ago, completely free, he let it sit untouched, then eventually took it down, claiming it didn't bring in the right kind of customers. The shop kept going out of sheer stubbornness. But the last 2 years had been especially hard for him. I heard through a friend that he considered selling. Still too proud to say so out loud, but the numbers didn't lie. What he didn't know was that I'd already bought the commercial property next door, and the one next to that, quietly, through a holding company, with no name that could be traced back to me. I'd been watching, waiting. Then, 6 months ago, the shop's landlord listed the property for sale. It had been owned by a retired couple who were finally ready to cash out and move closer to their kids. They didn't even put up a sign. They reached out to their network, hoping for a quick, quiet sale. I heard about it within 2 days. I made an offer. They accepted. And just like that, I became the owner of the building my father's shop had rented for over 25 years. I didn't evict him. Not immediately. Instead, I waited for the lease to come up. I had plans for that property. Big ones. And now, as of last week, I put those plans in motion. He received the notice on a Monday, a formal letter stating that the lease would not be renewed. He had 60 days to vacate the premises. I knew exactly how he would react. The frustration, the confusion, the anger. I also knew what he'd do next. He'd go to Callie, because Callie always had solutions, or at least the confidence to pretend she did. She was married now to a man named Spencer. He worked in finance, or so I was told. They both lived comfortably and liked to remind people of it. I'm sure they thought they could find a loophole, or maybe even scare the new owner into reconsidering. But they didn't realize the owner was me. Not yet. And so began the flood of messages. First polite, then frantic, then emotional. Lucian, your father is going through a lot right now. Please don't ignore us. We've all made mistakes, but hurting the family won't fix anything. You're being unfair. We had no idea things were this serious. That last one made me pause. No idea things were this serious? 3 years ago, they toasted to being rid of me. They held a backyard celebration about it. And now, suddenly, I was supposed to believe they cared? Still, I didn't respond. Because the truth was, they hadn't even discovered the rest of it yet. They didn't know what I planned to build in place of the shop. They didn't know who had already signed on to the project. They didn't know that I'd quietly acquired 2 other properties connected to the family, both through legal, above-board means. I wasn't rushing anything. That's the part people tend to misunderstand about revenge. Real, meaningful revenge. It's not loud. It's not fast. It's not throwing a tantrum or calling people out on social media. It's quiet, intentional, unfolding slowly, like a letter they didn't bother to read until it was too late. By the time my father realized I owned the building, he was already making calls to lawyers and contacts he swore would help him buy it out from under whoever held the deed. That was the moment Callie stepped in. She called me. I didn't answer. So she texted. Something short, almost laughable. We need to talk. It's about the building. Please don't be stubborn. That word, stubborn, made me pause. It was the same word my father always used to describe me growing up. Not focused. Not independent. Just stubborn. Like I was being difficult for the sake of it, instead of quietly trying to survive in a house where my voice never seemed to carry. Still, I didn't answer. The next day, I got a call from Spencer. I hadn't spoken to him in years. He'd never made much of an effort to know me beyond occasional family events where he'd ask what I did, then zone out halfway through my explanation. This time, he left a voicemail. Hey Lucian. Look, I know there's been tension, but maybe we can sit down and figure something out. Your dad's business is part of this community, and pushing him out isn't going to look great. I'm sure you don't want to burn bridges like that." It wasn't even threatening, just arrogant. Like he assumed I hadn't thought this through. Like I hadn't already factored in community perception, local support, and what the space could become. I was quiet because I didn't need to be loud, because I had already bought the 2 adjacent lots. And together, those 3 spaces, my father's auto shop, the abandoned thrift store next door, and the closed-down diner at the end of the block, were about to become something new, something local, something thriving. A collaborative workspace and learning hub for small business owners. With rentable offices, free workshops, marketing resources, and pop-up retail spaces. I was going to offer what I never had: opportunities for people like me. People who were overlooked, underestimated, called stubborn. And guess whose family name would be nowhere on the front door? Right. None of them. The building's new name was the Rooted Market. Not flashy, not corporate, just grounded, quiet, like me. But now let's rewind a bit, because I promised to show you the villains too. My family didn't just forget about me. They dismissed me. 3 years ago, when I was at my lowest, Callie posted that photo with the caption, "Karma works fast." She knew exactly what she was doing. That wasn't some vague platitude. It was a jab, a public celebration that I had, in her eyes, finally fallen in line with the version of me she always imagined, disposable. At family dinners, she used to joke that I was the quiet observer, like that was some charming personality trait. But it wasn't admiration. It was a performance. She liked having someone around who made her look louder, brighter. Someone whose silence made space for her stories. My father, well, he hadn't said more than 2 sentences to me in years that didn't involve something I should be doing better. When I got promoted? Took you long enough. When I bought my first car? Used? That's not very impressive. When I offered to help with their taxes one year? I'll handle it. Don't mess things up. My mother was quieter in her cruelty. She never insulted me outright. She just asked pointed questions in soft tones. "Are you sure that's a good use of your time? Maybe don't get your hopes up too high. I just don't want you to be disappointed again." Disappointed again. Like disappointment was something I caused, not something they created. So when they started to unravel, it wasn't just about the building. It was about losing control of the story they'd crafted. Because Callie, ever the public figure of the family, had always painted our home as close-knit, supportive, traditional. She posted photos of family barbecues, game nights, church picnics. But I noticed something over the years. I was never in them. Even when I was there. She cropped me out, literally and emotionally. And now she was calling. Because that quiet brother she cropped out? The one they toasted to forgetting? He suddenly held the keys to their father's legacy. But there was still more they didn't know. They didn't know that the Rooted Market had been funded, in part, by a grant program I helped design. One that prioritized businesses displaced by outdated landlords. They didn't know I had spoken to several mechanics in town, some of whom had worked for my father in the past and left because of his refusal to adapt. I'd already offered 2 of them space in the new co-op. And they certainly didn't know I had legally purchased the old building Callie had rented out as her creative studio for her design consulting business. The lease was up in 4 months. It took 2 full weeks before they realized the truth. 2 weeks of trying to wrangle information from people who refused to spill the beans, hoping that a lawyer or a quick phone call would get them the answers they so desperately wanted. During that time, I did what I'd been doing since the beginning of this whole plan. I watched the phone calls, the texts, and the passive-aggressive comments begin to stack up. They didn't quite know how to handle the fact that they were losing control of the story. At first, it seemed like they couldn't believe what was happening. The realization that the building was mine, my building, was one they couldn't accept, even after the formal notice had been served. My father was the first to snap. I imagine, in his mind, it wasn't a matter of losing the shop. It was about losing the power he'd held over the family and his legacy. My mother didn't speak much about it, but the look she gave me when I finally visited her to drop off some paperwork said everything. Disbelief, followed by that patented passive disappointment. I knew better than to expect an apology. That wasn't the point of my actions. I wasn't doing this for validation. I was doing it because, for once in my life, I wanted to take control. I wanted to build something that was mine, and something that didn't require me to sacrifice my integrity to keep it. But they weren't done yet. Not by a long shot. It started slowly. My phone pinged with a text from Callie. It was an invitation for coffee, nothing unusual. She'd always reached out like that. Polite, Casual. Never too direct. I wasn't sure if I'd respond. But I did. Because, deep down, I knew what she was going to say. When I showed up at the cafe, she had that same air of "I'm in control" that she always wore. Callie had a way of making everything seem like a carefully orchestrated performance, like she knew how things would go even before they happened. She was one of those people who never let you see the cracks. Everything was polished. Perfect. Controlled. "Lucian," she said, looking up from her phone as I took a seat. "I know things are a bit tense right now, but we need to have a real conversation." "I'm listening." She leaned in, lowering her voice a little, like she was telling me something I should already know. "This isn't just about a building. You know that, right? This is about the family, the history, the legacy." "Right," I replied, trying not to roll my eyes. "But you've always been good at forgetting the history, as long as it's convenient for you." Her expression faltered for a second. She clearly wasn't expecting that response. "You're making a mistake here, Lucian. This isn't the way to fix things." I could have laughed. I could have told her that it was a little late for that kind of advice. But I didn't. Instead, I just nodded, watching her carefully. "What do you want me to do, Callie?" I asked her. "Say I'm sorry? That I was wrong to want something more? That I should have kept my mouth shut and kept living on the sidelines?" She didn't have an answer. Not right away. She blinked a few times, her eyes searching for a way to regain control of the conversation. But this wasn't her stage anymore. The audience wasn't who she thought it was. "You're burning bridges, Lucian," she finally said, her tone shifting, trying to come back at me with her usual authoritative flair. "You don't know what this will do to the family." I leaned back in my chair, letting her words hang in the air. Maybe it's not about the family anymore. Maybe it's about something better. Something that doesn't need their approval. Callie stared at me. She opened her mouth as if to say something else, but then closed it. I could see her processing the shift in the conversation. I'd already taken the power back, and she couldn't get it back without admitting she'd lost it in the first place. She exhaled, her shoulders slumping. She was done for now. I could see it in her eyes. "I'll talk to Dad," she said quietly. "But don't think you're going to get away with this." I didn't respond. I just watched her walk out of the cafe. A part of me wanted to feel satisfaction, but another part of me just felt empty. There was no victory in this conversation. It was just the beginning of them realizing what had already slipped from their grasp. The next few days were a blur. My phone didn't stop ringing. Texts from Spencer, calls from my mom, long voicemail messages that ranged from questions about the lease to half-hearted attempts at guilt-tripping me into coming to my senses. And through it all, I stayed silent. Until the day came when everything changed. My father showed up at my door. No warning. Just knocked on the front door of my apartment, and there he stood, looking older than I remembered. His hands were in his pockets, and his face was tight, like he was trying to hold it all together. He didn't say anything right away. He just stood there, taking in the view of the small place I'd made for myself, my little corner of the world. The one I'd built piece by piece, without anyone's help. "Can we talk?" he asked finally, his voice a little softer than usual. I stepped aside and motioned for him to come in. He hesitated before crossing the threshold. He looked like he was about to say something else, but then stopped himself, like he was unsure of where to begin. I poured us both water, but neither of us spoke while we sat at my kitchen table. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Finally, my father broke it. "You're really going to let it all go, aren't you?" "It's already gone," I replied. He looked at me. His eyes narrowed. "You think this is about the shop? This is about your family, Lucian. Your mother, your sister, everything we've built. It's falling apart. Do you really want that?" I didn't respond immediately. I just looked at him. I didn't need to say anything. The reality was too clear. He hadn't been there for me when I needed him. And now, when I had built something of my own, he was trying to pull me back into his broken world, where no one ever really got what they deserved. "It's not falling apart," I finally said. "It's just changing. And for once, I'm not going to be the one left behind." He didn't argue with that. For a moment, I thought he might apologize, or at least offer some kind of understanding. But he didn't. Instead, he just stood up, shook his head, and left without another word. The months that followed were quieter than I expected. My father never tried to fight the legal battle over the shop, and Callie made a few more passive-aggressive comments on social media before disappearing into her perfect little world of design gigs and branded content. Spencer, on the other hand, stopped reaching out. I think he realized that I didn't need his help to succeed, and that stung more than anything else. For all his wealth and influence, it didn't matter when the ground shifted beneath him, and I was standing on solid ground. I didn't just survive. I thrived. The rooted market flourished, drawing in small business owners and young entrepreneurs who hadn't had access to resources like this before. It was a place of growth, of learning, of true collaboration. It was exactly what I had wanted to create from the start. And as for my family, they watched from a distance. They knew they had lost, but they couldn't admit it. They couldn't accept that the family they had worked so hard to control, my family, had finally learned how to stand on its own. In the end, I got what I wanted. Not revenge, but freedom. The kind that only comes when you stop asking for permission. When you stop pretending to be part of a broken system that was never built for you to succeed. I'm Aaron, 29 years old, and if there's one thing I've learned from my family, it's that being the responsible one isn't an honor, it's a trap. For years, I carried that label like it was a medal, but in reality, it was just a leash they used to tug me back whenever my brother messed up. And believe me, he messed up often. His name's Ryan. He's 26, charming when it benefits him, lazy when it doesn't, and somehow always manages to make his failures everyone else's problem. Our parents, especially my mom, have spent his entire life cushioning his landings while expecting me to build the safety net. I guess you could say I was the backup plan, emotionally, financially, and even socially. It's not like I had a rough childhood, but it wasn't exactly balanced either. I was the overachiever, top grades, steady job, the one who never causes trouble. Ryan, on the other hand, was the free spirit, the creative one. Those were the words my mom loved to use when she didn't want to admit that her youngest son just didn't want to work. Dad stayed mostly quiet about it, though occasionally, after a few beers, he'd sigh and say something like, "He'll figure it out eventually." Spoiler, he never did. I started working right after college, first as an intern, then climbing my way up in an international logistics company. Long hours, little sleep, constant pressure, but I didn't mind. It felt good to earn what I had. Meanwhile, Ryan drifted from one part-time job to another, quitting whenever it got too stressful. And every time he did, there'd be a familiar knock on my door or a call from mom saying, "Aaron, your brother's going through a tough time. Can you help him out just this once?" That phrase, "just this once," became a running joke in my head. It had been going on for nearly 8 years. The latest incident started on an ordinary Sunday afternoon. I'd gone over to my parents' house for lunch, mostly because mom guilt me into it. She said she missed me, but I knew she really meant she wanted to talk about Ryan. I found him sprawled on the couch, still in pajamas, watching some YouTube video about manifesting success. He barely looked up when I came in. "Hey," I said, setting down a bottle of iced tea on the table. "You working these days, or still looking?" He gave me that smirk he always wore when he was about to say something irritating. "Actually, I quit last week," he said casually, as if he were announcing that he'd changed shampoo brands. "Wasn't for me." I blinked. "You quit again? You were only there 2 months." "Yeah. Well, I didn't like how they ran things. Toxic management. They expect you to show up early, stay late, kiss up for pennies. Not my vibe." I couldn't stop myself from sighing. "That's kind of how jobs work, Ryan." He rolled his eyes. "You wouldn't understand. You're fine being a corporate robot. I actually want to live." That comment stuck like a thorn, but I let it slide. Mom appeared just then with a plate of roasted chicken, smiling too brightly, as if she could sense the tension. "Boys, no arguing today, please," she said. "Aaron, did you bring that resume template you used? Maybe you can help Ryan update his." I looked at her, then at him. "Mom, he just said he doesn't want another job." Ryan leaned back on the couch, folding his arms. "Exactly. I need time to reset. Maybe I'll start my own business or something." Dad, who had been silent until then, muttered, "With what money?" Ryan ignored him completely. "I have ideas," he said. "Unlike some people, I don't plan on wasting my life in an office cubicle." I laughed under my breath. "Ideas are great, but they don't pay rent. That was when he scoffed, loud, dismissive, like my entire existence was a joke to him. Must be nice having no real responsibilities, he said. You've got your cushy job, no wife, no kids, no real problems. You think you're better because you sit at a desk all day? The words hit harder than I expected. For years, I'd been the one helping him out, covering his rent once when he got evicted, paying for his car repairs, even lending him money to invest in some half-baked online course he never finished. And now he was belittling me for having stability. I just stared at him for a long moment, trying to figure out whether to respond or walk away. Mom quickly intervened. "Ryan, that's not fair," she said in her scolding voice, but there was no real conviction behind it. She turned to me instead. "Aaron, don't take it personally. You know how he gets when he's stressed." "Stressed?" I said quietly. "He quit his job voluntarily, Mom." Her smile faltered. "He's finding himself. You should support him." I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it all. Support him? Again? After everything? But I didn't want to ruin the family lunch, so I just said, "I'm not doing this anymore, Mom. I can't keep covering for him." Ryan looked up from his phone, eyebrow raised. "Covering for me? What are you even talking about?" I took a deep breath. "I've helped you out more times than I can count, Ryan. Rent, bills, car repairs. Every time you mess up, I'm the one cleaning it up. You never even say thank you." He shrugged. "You chose to help. No one forced you." That was it. That tone, that smug indifference, it lit something in me. The part of me that had been quiet for years finally stirred. "You're right," I said slowly. "No one forced me. But I'm done now." The room fell silent. Dad looked uncomfortable. Mom frowned like I'd just betrayed a family code, and Ryan looked bored. He picked up his phone again, muttering, "Whatever. You'll cave eventually. You always do." But this time I didn't. What they didn't know, what I hadn't told anyone yet, was that I'd just been offered a huge promotion overseas, a managerial position in our company's Singapore branch. It was everything I'd worked for: higher pay, travel benefits, and a chance to start over somewhere far from the constant family drama. The offer had been sitting in my inbox for 2 days, and I'd been torn about it. I wasn't sure I could leave my parents behind. But at that moment, watching Ryan's dismissive expression, I felt the decision solidify inside me like concrete. Later that night, I sat in my apartment, staring at my computer screen with the email draft open. My finger hovered over the mouse, ready to hit send. Then my phone buzzed, a text from Mom. "Ryan told me you were rude today," it read. "You need to be patient with him. He's family, and he's struggling. Don't abandon him when he needs you most." I could almost hear her voice in those words, soft and guilt-laden. But for once, I didn't feel guilty. I felt free. I typed out my response carefully. "I've supported him for years, Mom. I need to live my own life now." Her reply came seconds later. "He's family, fix this." That was it. No empathy, no acknowledgement, just an order. Something inside me broke for good. I didn't reply. I just hit send on that acceptance email, shut my laptop, and let the weight lift off my shoulders. I didn't know then that the real chaos would start the next morning. That Mom would blow up my phone with missed calls. That Ryan would show up at my apartment demanding answers. Or that my decision to finally put myself first would shatter every illusion of loyalty they had. But in that quiet moment before it all unraveled, I finally felt like I was choosing myself for once. And I had no idea how much that choice was going to cost. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing nonstop. The screen was lit up with notifications, missed calls, voicemails, texts, all from Mom and Ryan. 39 missed calls in total. It was almost impressive. I just stared at it for a while, still half asleep, before muttering, "Unbelievable." The first message from Mom read, "Call me immediately. This is serious." Then another one. "I can't believe you'd do something so selfish, Aaron." And then, "Ryan came to see you last night and said you refused to talk. What's going on with you?" I hadn't even seen him. He must have tried to drop by after I'd gone to bed early. I scrolled further. The last text from her said, "He's your brother. You can't just cut him off because he's struggling. Fix this before it's too late." There was no mention of the promotion. No congratulations. No curiosity. Nothing. It hit me, slowly but painfully, that my entire family dynamic had always revolved around Ryan's comfort and everyone else's responsibility to maintain it. The more I thought about it, the more the pattern became painfully obvious. Every time Ryan failed, Mom made it my job to fix it. Every time I succeeded, it somehow became an insult to him. I spent most of that morning ignoring the calls, sipping coffee while packing up some documents for work. The company HR had already confirmed my relocation date. I'd be leaving in 6 weeks. 6 weeks to tie up loose ends and maybe, finally, detach myself from this exhausting cycle. Around noon, my phone buzzed again. This time it was Dad. "Aaron," his text said, "I think you should talk to your brother. Your mom's really upset. Let's keep the peace, all right?" There it was, the quiet plea I'd heard 1,000 times before. Keep the peace. Never mind that the peace meant swallowing my frustration and letting Ryan's behavior slide yet again. I typed back, "I'll call later." But I didn't. Instead, that evening, I came home to find Ryan sitting on the steps outside my apartment building. He was wearing the same wrinkled hoodie from the weekend, arms crossed, foot tapping impatiently. I froze at the sight of him. "What are you doing here?" I asked. He didn't even look up right away. "You're ignoring everyone," he said flatly. "Because I don't want to talk," I replied, walking past him toward the door. He stood quickly. "You think you can just ghost your family? Mom's freaking out." I turned around. "She's freaking out because I finally said no." He scoffed. "No, she's freaking out because you're being dramatic. You've always had this superiority complex, thinking you're better than us because you've got a job and a paycheck." I clenched my jaw. "Ryan, this isn't about being better. This is about boundaries. You've been relying on me for years, and I'm done being your safety net." He laughed, but there was a sharp edge to it. "Wow, you sound just like Dad. Cold and self-righteous. You think you're some kind of hero because you pay your bills on time." I didn't answer. He kept going. "You know what's funny?" he said. "Mom told me about that overseas job. She said you were thinking about turning it down because of us." "Guess not, huh? Guess you finally got too good for your own family." So Mom had told him. That stung more than I wanted to admit. I hadn't even shared the news officially, and she'd already turned it into a family discussion, probably framing it as my abandonment. "You shouldn't have found out from her," I said. "That was personal." Ryan shrugged. "We don't keep secrets in this family. Or at least we didn't, until you started acting like you're above everyone." I could feel the heat rising in my chest. "Ryan, I've covered for you so many times I've lost count. When you lost your job at the car dealership, who paid your rent? When your car broke down, who wired you the money to fix it? You've never even said thank you." He stared at me for a long moment, expression unreadable. Then he said quietly, "I didn't ask you to do any of that." That sentence, short, simple, and cruel, cut deeper than any insult could have. I stepped back, suddenly realizing that nothing I'd done had ever mattered to him. He didn't appreciate it. He expected it. It was my role. "I'm leaving," I said finally. "And this time, I'm not changing my mind." He rolled his eyes. "You'll come crawling back when you realize no one out there cares about you like family does." That line stuck with me long after he left. The following week, Mom started her campaign. That's what I came to call it, the guilt campaign. Every day, there was another text, another phone call, another attempt to make me reconsider. Monday, "You're being heartless." Ryan's depressed. He needs your support. Tuesday, "He's your brother, Aaron. If you don't help him, who will?" Wednesday, "I can't sleep knowing you're tearing this family apart." Each message chipped away at me, but I stayed silent. The part that hurt the most was how easily she dismissed everything I'd ever done. It was like all those years of reliability meant nothing the moment I refused to keep enabling Ryan. By the end of the week, she started using a different tactic, emotional manipulation disguised as concern. "I worry about you out there all alone," she wrote one evening. "You won't have anyone if something goes wrong." It was the kind of line that would have worked on me a year ago. Not now. When I didn't respond, she switched gears again. "Ryan's trying to get his life together. He just needs a small loan to hold him over until he finds something stable." There it was. The real reason behind all the drama. I called her that night, for the first time since everything blew up. Her voice was calm, almost rehearsed. "Finally," she said. "I was starting to think you'd blocked me." "I almost did," I admitted. "Mom, please tell me you didn't send Ryan to my place again." She sighed dramatically. "He's your brother. He's been through a lot. The least you can do is help him while he's searching for a new job." I closed my eyes. "You mean the job he quit 2 weeks ago?" "You don't understand, Aaron. He's different. Sensitive. He doesn't handle stress like you do." "That's because he's never had to handle it," I said quietly. "You protect him from everything. You treat him like a child." She gasped, as if I'd insulted her personally. How dare you say that? I'm just trying to keep the family together. No, you're trying to keep him comfortable, I said, at everyone else's expense. There was a long pause on the line. Then she said, if your father could hear you right now, he'd be ashamed. That one hurt. I almost hung up right there, but she wasn't done. Ryan told me you yelled at him, she continued. He came home upset. You know he looks up to you. Is this really how you want to treat him before you leave? I bit my tongue. Looks up to me? He'd done nothing but belittle me for years. I didn't yell at him, I said evenly. I told him the truth, that I'm done bailing him out. Her voice sharpened. That's cruel. You've changed, Aaron. You used to care about family. I still do, I said. That's why I'm not helping anymore. Because enabling him isn't love, Mom. It's destruction. She went silent for a moment, then said quietly, if you hang up now, don't expect us to call again. I hesitated, feeling the familiar ache of guilt twist in my chest. But then I remembered all those nights I'd stayed up transferring money I couldn't spare, all those weekends I'd spent fixing his messes while they praised him for trying. I hung up. The next few days were strangely quiet. No calls, no texts, no guilt trips. I thought maybe they'd finally accepted my decision. But I should have known better. That Saturday, I came home from work to find an envelope taped to my door. Inside was a note in my mother's handwriting. We're disappointed in you. Ryan lost his apartment because you refused to help. He's staying with us for now, but we can't afford to keep supporting him. I hope you're happy. There was no signature, just her name at the bottom. Mom. Like a period at the end of a threat. I sat on my couch, the letter trembling slightly in my hand. Part of me wanted to drive over there and argue, defend myself, explain that I wasn't responsible for his choices. But another part of me, stronger this time, knew it wouldn't matter. The moment I said no, I became the villain in their story. The following week, I tried to focus on work. I threw myself into preparing for the overseas transfer, reviewing budgets, logistics plans, team structures, anything to keep my mind off the constant chaos my family created. But every time I closed my laptop, it was there, a gnawing tension in my chest that wouldn't let me relax. Even when I tried to convince myself that this was my life now, my family's shadow lingered, dark and impossible to ignore. Then, one Thursday morning, I got a call from the building manager of my apartment complex. The name flashed on my phone, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Hello, I said cautiously. Hi, Aaron. This is Mrs. Patel from 7B. I just wanted to let you know someone was here asking for you. Her tone was polite, but there was an edge of hesitation. They left something with me. I frowned. Who was it? There wasn't a name. Just your brother, she said quietly. My stomach dropped. He was here? What did he leave? Mrs. Patel cleared her throat. It's a package. And, well, he seemed upset. I didn't wait to thank her. I hung up and grabbed the envelope from my door. Another one taped there like before, but larger, heavier this time. My fingers shook slightly as I opened it, and my heart sank the moment I saw the contents. Inside was a USB drive, along with a single folded sheet of paper. On it, written in a careful, almost clinical script, were the words, Aaron, you think you can leave us behind, but family comes first. This will remind you. I stared at it for a moment, trying to make sense of the cryptic message. Then, out of a mix of curiosity and dread, I plugged the USB into my laptop. What appeared on my screen made my stomach churn and my hands go cold. It was a folder labeled Aaron, Personal Files. Inside were screenshots of my online banking account, personal emails, and even copies of confidential documents from my company. Everything I had ever considered private. And then I saw it, a series of recordings. Some were of phone calls I'd made discussing my promotion and plans to move overseas. Others were video clips of me leaving my apartment, coming home late from work, and even entering bank branches. My jaw went slack. I couldn't believe it. Someone had been watching me, documenting me. And then it hit me. This wasn't some anonymous hacker. The handwriting on the note, the timing, the personal knowledge of my life, down to my exact schedule, it had to be Ryan. He had gone through my apartment while I was gone, stolen access to my information, and recorded me without my knowledge. I felt a mix of rage, betrayal, and disbelief. I wanted to scream, to call Mom, to confront Ryan immediately, but I knew better. This was beyond a simple argument or guilt trip. This was deliberate, a calculated violation of every boundary I had fought to establish. I sat on the couch for what felt like hours, staring at the screen. Part of me wanted to confront him directly, to demand an explanation, to yell until my voice broke. But the rational part, the part that had been quietly simmering for weeks, fed up with enabling and manipulation, knew that this was an opening, a tool I could use. I just had to figure out how. Later that evening, I tried to call Ryan. No answer. I sent a message. We need to talk. Now. Minutes passed. Nothing. I called again, and again, no response. It was as if he knew I wouldn't immediately lash out, that I would sit and stew and consider my next move. And I did. I thought about the history, the way my parents had always shielded him, excused him, and dismissed my frustrations. The way Mom had guilted me into financial support time and again. The way Dad had stood silently, occasionally muttering his vague, conditional support for Ryan, but never stepping in when I bore the brunt of responsibility. This, whatever Ryan had done, was the culmination of years of being pushed to my limits, a blatant declaration that they thought they could take anything from me and I'd still bend. Then came the next shock. Later that night, I checked my email and saw a string of notifications from my bank. My heart sank as I opened the first one. A large withdrawal had been attempted from my account, flagged by the system because it exceeded my usual transactions. Another and another. Each one traced back to an account that was registered under my parents' names, Mom and Dad. They had tried to siphon money out of my account. And now it clicked. The USB. The recordings. Ryan wasn't just taking notes for family concern. He and my parents had been plotting to manipulate me, maybe even blackmail me into supporting him one last time. I paced my apartment, the weight of betrayal pressing down on me. I couldn't believe they would go this far. I had done everything right, worked hard, supported the family, stayed patient through years of their favoritism and excuses. And now they had escalated to invading my privacy and attempting to control my finances. The emotional sting wasn't just anger, it was grief. I sat down, trying to process it, and realized something important. They had underestimated me. I hadn't responded with fear or guilt, not yet. I had spent years being the responsible one, the one who gave them the benefit of the doubt. But now, I had something they didn't expect: leverage. Information. Evidence of their attempts to manipulate and intimidate me. For the first time in years, I felt the cold thrill of clarity. This wasn't just about refusing to help my brother anymore. This was about standing my ground, about reclaiming my life from a family that had systematically tried to control it for their own convenience. That night, I sat in front of my laptop, the USB drive in front of me, and thought about my next steps. There was no rush. Ryan and Mom had already made their move, thinking they had the upper hand. But they didn't know me as well as they thought. I started organizing the files, categorizing everything I'd discovered. Banking records, private correspondence, timestamps of activities. They were all pieces of a puzzle that painted a clear picture of their manipulation. I realized that this wasn't just about revenge. It was about protecting myself, about creating a record so that no one could gaslight me or pretend that my feelings of betrayal were unfounded. As I worked, I reflected on the countless times I had tried to mediate, to be the good son and the supportive brother. I remembered late nights when I'd wired Ryan money I didn't really have, explained his failures to friends and coworkers to cover for him, and smoothed over conflicts with parents who insisted that I was selfish for expecting accountability. Every instance now felt like a rehearsal for the stand I was about to take. And then, just as I finished categorizing the last file, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Ryan. "We need to talk. You can't just ignore this." I stared at it, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and anticipation. He had finally realized I wasn't going to cave, but he had no idea that I wasn't approaching this blindly. I wasn't scared. I wasn't flustered. I was calculating my next move, and for the first time, I felt in control of a situation my family had dominated for years. I typed back, "We'll talk." But this time, the rules are different. I didn't send it immediately. Instead, I placed the phone face down on the table and leaned back, letting the weight of the moment settle in. This was it, the turning point. The act of betrayal had cracked open the door to a new reality. One where I wasn't just the scapegoat or the caretaker anymore. One where I could finally take control. The next week felt like living in a pressure cooker. My apartment, which I had always considered my sanctuary, became a war zone in my mind. Every notification, every buzz of my phone, was another reminder that my family had crossed a line. Mom's calls were relentless, sometimes sweet and pleading, sometimes cold and commanding, but always with that undertone that made it clear she expected me to obey. Ryan texted sporadically, shifting between desperate pleas and thinly veiled threats, and I couldn't even bring myself to answer. I had to step back completely. It hurt, more than I expected. Not the physical kind of hurt, but the emotional kind that seeps into your bones. I felt betrayed, abandoned, and alone. My hands shook the first time I looked at the USB drive again, realizing the depth of what had been done. Every private email, every personal financial transaction, every single corner of my life meticulously observed and recorded. The thought that my own brother had orchestrated this, and my parents had quietly enabled it, was unbearable. I didn't know where to start, so I did the only thing I could. I walked away. Not literally at first. I stayed in my apartment, shutting out the world, turning off notifications, and focusing on the one thing I could control, my own life. I stopped answering calls, even from friends who hadn't known about the chaos. I allowed myself to feel the anger, the grief, the exhaustion, and the betrayal. It was painful, but it was necessary. During that week, I forced myself to step outside my immediate panic and think strategically. My promotion was still in the pipeline, and I realized that it wasn't just a job offer. It was my ticket out of the toxic loop I'd been trapped in for so long. I started preparing in earnest. I organized my finances, upgraded my professional portfolio, researched the city I'd be moving to, and even began taking online courses to strengthen my managerial skills. Each small step reminded me that the world beyond my family existed, and that it could be better than this. Even as I rebuilt my professional life, I had moments of doubt. I replayed countless interactions with Ryan and Mom, trying to reconcile the versions of them I had known with the versions that had tried to undermine me. It was exhausting, but in the quiet of my apartment at night, I began to realize something powerful. I didn't need their approval. I didn't need their permission. For the first time, I had a life that belonged to me, not dictated by guilt or obligation. Work became my anchor. I spent hours coordinating logistics projects, leading virtual meetings with colleagues across multiple continents, and presenting strategic proposals to senior management. My work was recognized. My boss commented on my diligence, my organization, and my ability to handle pressure with calm precision. I received commendations for projects that required weeks of planning, and for the first time, I felt that my achievements were being appreciated on their own merit. Not by family, not by anyone who had ever manipulated me, but by people who could see the value in my effort. As my professional life flourished, I started to see my personal life stabilize as well. I began exercising again after long months of stress-induced neglect. I cooked healthy meals, walked more, and even started keeping a small journal to process everything. The simple act of writing down my thoughts every morning helped me see patterns I hadn't noticed before. I realized that for years, I had allowed their demands to dominate my choices, to dictate my self-worth. But now I was free, truly free. One night, I sat on my balcony overlooking the city, a glass of water in hand, and thought about Ryan and Mom. I realized something important. They had underestimated me. They thought that emotional manipulation, guilt, and fear would bend me. But they didn't know that I had been quietly building a life beyond them while they were busy trying to pull me back. I had grown in ways they couldn't see or control. I had gained financial independence, a respected position in my company, and a level of self-awareness that made me untouchable in ways they had never imagined. It wasn't immediate. I had moments where I felt like I was breaking, where the loneliness and betrayal weighed heavily on me. But each time, I reminded myself that their power over me existed only if I let it. And slowly, day by day, I felt stronger. By the end of the month, I had applied for my visa, booked my flight, and signed the paperwork for my overseas relocation. The thought of leaving behind the constant toxicity, the manipulations, the guilt trips, the favoritism, filled me with relief. But I also realized that leaving wasn't enough. I wanted something more than escape. I wanted to reclaim my dignity and power in a way they couldn't touch. I started to quietly collect evidence. The USB drive, the banking alerts, the recordings, all of it was organized into a secure cloud folder. I documented everything meticulously, noting dates, times, and actions taken by Ryan and my parents. It wasn't just about having leverage. It was about protecting myself from being gaslit later, about having a record that proved what they had done. For the first time, I felt like the one in control, the one setting the terms. The days leading up to my departure were a blur of packing, finalizing work projects, and mental preparation. Ryan tried one last time, sending a text that said, "You'll regret leaving. You're abandoning us when we need you most. Family is supposed to stick together." I didn't reply. I didn't even glance at it. Instead, I smiled quietly, thinking of how far I had come. For years, I had been trapped in their expectations, bending my life around their needs. Now, I had a plan, a future, and power they couldn't take away. The night before my flight, I went through my apartment one last time, checking that everything was in order. I stopped in front of the door, staring at the spot where the previous envelope had been taped. The memory of betrayal was sharp, but instead of despair, I felt resolve. I had survived their worst, and I was stronger for it. As I zipped my suitcase and placed the USB drive in a secure lockbox, I realized something crucial. This wasn't just about moving across the world. It was about reclaiming control, proving that I could live on my own terms. For the first time, I was not the family scapegoat. I was my own person, and nothing they did could change that. I fell asleep that night with a strange mix of anticipation and calm. I knew that leaving wasn't going to end the story. Ryan and my parents wouldn't simply let me go. They were too used to bending me to their will. But I also knew that I had the advantage now. I had distance, strategy, and clarity. I had built a foundation that no amount of manipulation could shake. And in that quiet, just before dawn, I felt something I hadn't in years: hope. Not the fragile, fleeting hope of a desperate child, but the steady, unshakable hope of someone who had survived betrayal, found their strength, and was preparing to rise above it. By the time my flight boarded, I wasn't the same Aaron who had spent years cleaning up Ryan's messes and appeasing my parents. I was someone new, someone stronger, someone who had finally learned that the only person I needed to rely on was myself. And I knew that when the time came to confront them, I wouldn't be reacting out of anger or fear. I would be deliberate, calculated, and unstoppable. Settling into Singapore was disorienting at first, but in the best way possible. The city was overwhelming in size and energy, and I loved it. I rented a small apartment near the financial district, just enough to feel independent, but not so large that it became a burden. The first few days were spent navigating public transport, learning the city layout, and meeting my new team. But even in the whirlwind of orientation and introductions, I couldn't shake the family drama waiting back home. Every time I checked my email or messages, I saw the occasional missed call or vague text from Mom or Ryan. I didn't respond, of course. Distance was my first tool in the quiet setup I had begun to imagine. Work consumed me immediately. I was managing a team of over 20 people, overseeing operations across multiple countries in Asia, and presenting to senior executives almost daily. The pace was insane, but I thrived on it. For the first time in years, I felt challenged in a way that was exciting, not draining. And as I settled in, I noticed a pattern in the way I worked that had been invisible back home. I had an eye for opportunity, a knack for understanding complex systems, and the patience to see things through. My colleagues started noticing too, and within a few weeks, I had already earned a reputation as someone dependable, strategic, and quietly assertive. It was during a project meeting 2 weeks in that I realized something crucial. We were discussing the logistics of a new regional distribution deal, and I noticed an inefficiency in the supply chain that, if corrected, would save the company millions. Most of the senior managers dismissed it as a minor issue, but I insisted on a deeper analysis. By the end of the meeting, I had convinced the team to run simulations. The results were staggering. My proposed change would streamline operations and significantly reduce costs across multiple countries. I left that meeting feeling a thrill I hadn't felt in years, the same feeling I remembered when I first started excelling in my career back home. It was power, real power, the kind that doesn't come from family pressure or emotional manipulation, but from competence, insight, and influence. I realized then that if I could wield this kind of influence in my career, there were ways I could leverage it to protect myself and, maybe, to assert control over the people who had tried to control me. While I was gaining recognition at work, I also began studying the financial side of things. I had saved diligently over the years, but now I had a concrete goal: independence not just geographically, but financially. I wanted a foundation so solid that no one back home could shake me. I started investing cautiously at first, focusing on stable assets, then gradually diversifying into areas with higher returns. Each step gave me confidence. Each success, small as it was a reminder that I didn't need my family's approval or support to thrive. But the most important breakthrough came when I realized the full extent of the USB files. They weren't just evidence of betrayal, they were leverage. Ryan and my parents had overstepped, assuming I'd be paralyzed by guilt or fear. But now, I understood that this information gave me a choice. I could let it simmer, hidden and unused, while I built my strength, or I could use it strategically at the right moment to assert myself. And I began to formulate a plan, quietly, carefully, in the margins of my mind as I walked to work, cooked dinner, or fell asleep at night. The plan wasn't immediate revenge. That would have been reckless. No, this was about building an unassailable position first. About creating a scenario where I held the cards, where they had no leverage over me, and where any action they took would only confirm my authority. I started by learning everything I could about their lives from afar. Not spying in a creepy way, but observing patterns, subtle slips, and ways they had previously manipulated me. I studied their financial habits, their reliance on me, and their emotional weaknesses. The more I learned, the clearer the roadmap became. Meanwhile, my own life was improving at a pace I hadn't dared hope for. Work offered me a sense of identity outside my family drama, and for the first time in years, I was making decisions based solely on my priorities. I traveled to neighboring countries for business trips, mingled with colleagues who respected my judgment, and even started networking with executives who had the kind of influence I had only dreamed of before. Each interaction was a reminder that I could build real power outside the reach of anyone who had tried to diminish me. And slowly, the anger that had consumed me transformed. It was no longer raw or reactive. It became measured and precise, tempered by the awareness that timing and control were essential. The USB files were my secret weapon, but I didn't flaunt them. I kept them secure, backed up, and encrypted. They were not just a record of betrayal. They were proof that I could act if necessary, evidence that I was no longer vulnerable. I began to feel a sense of control that was intoxicating. It was during one particularly late night at work that the final piece clicked. I was reviewing projections for a multinational client, running complex simulations of shipping logistics, when I realized something astonishing. The company's operations in Southeast Asia were interlinked with a series of partnerships in my home country, the same country where my parents and Ryan lived. If I played my cards correctly, I could create leverage that extended beyond personal boundaries into financial and professional realms. I didn't need to yell or argue. I could let systems, rules, and the weight of evidence do the talking. From that night onward, every project I tackled, every meeting I attended, every strategic decision I made became a part of my quiet preparation. I wasn't just building my career, I was building influence. Influence that could protect me from my family, and eventually, influence that could make them realize that their manipulation no longer mattered. Even my personal life began to improve in ways I hadn't expected. Living alone, I discovered routines and hobbies I'd neglected for years. I cooked meals I actually enjoyed, explored local markets, and even started journaling extensively about my thoughts, plans, and goals. Each day, I felt more grounded, more confident. My energy wasn't consumed by guilt or obligations imposed by others. It was spent on building something real for myself. And then, just when I thought I was settling into this new life fully, I received an unexpected email from one of the executives I had met during a recent networking event. It was a tip about an upcoming strategic initiative in a company affiliated with my parents' business circles. Nothing overt, just a subtle suggestion that I could gain insight into movements that might be useful later. My pulse quickened. This was the first tangible connection between the life I was building overseas and the world I had left behind. It was small, but it was enough to make me realize that the opportunity for leverage was real and closer than I had imagined. That night, I sat in my apartment, reviewing everything. The USB files, my financial records, my career achievements, and now, this subtle professional insight. I felt a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in years. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to betrayal. I was preparing. I was shaping a plan that, when executed, would be undeniable, precise, and devastatingly effective. I knew the next steps would require patience. I couldn't rush this. Any misstep could give them an opening, a chance to manipulate or guilt me again. But I also knew one thing for certain. I was no longer the Aaron who would bend under pressure, who would apologize for setting boundaries, who would sacrifice his life for the convenience of a lazy sibling and an entitled mother. That Aaron was gone. The Aaron that remained was focused, capable, and quietly gathering power. Every email, every meeting, every financial calculation, every strategic observation became a brick in the foundation of something bigger. And when the time came to act, I would not just respond to their manipulation. I would demonstrate, with undeniable precision, that I had risen above it entirely. As I leaned back in my chair and looked out at the city lights stretching into the distance, I realized I was ready. Not for confrontation yet, not for revenge, but for the next phase, the setup. The phase where patience, preparation, and power would align. Where every slight, every betrayal, every manipulation could be transformed into leverage. And deep down, I smiled, knowing that when I finally acted, they would not see it coming. Not even a little. This is the part where things stop being messy and start being surgical. I say surgical because that's how I approached it. Cold, clean, deliberate. I didn't want a blow-up that looked like drama. I wanted a dismantling that felt inevitable. For years, they'd treated me like an endless resource, a quiet guarantor who wouldn't fight back. That assumption became their weakness. The first move was practical and boring. I went to the bank. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten. I walked in with a printout of the transaction alerts and the timestamps from the USB, and I sat down with a customer service manager who actually listened. I explained what had happened: unauthorized access attempts, suspicious withdrawals linked to accounts that were not mine, and a USB full of recordings and screenshots that showed chain of evidence. The manager was professional. She took everything, made copies, and escalated the case to fraud. The bank immediately flagged my accounts, instituted extra authentication, and opened an internal inquiry. That move alone neutralized one weapon in their arsenal: the attempted siphoning of my money. It didn't feel like revenge so much as reclaiming the floor under my feet. But I knew neutralizing the immediate threat wouldn't be satisfying. I also knew there were different kinds of power: legal, financial, reputational, and that to protect myself I needed to wield more than one. So I engaged a lawyer, not an angry, headline-chasing lawyer, but someone meticulous and quietly fierce. I handed over copies of the files, explained the pattern of harassment and the evidence of trespass and recorded surveillance. The lawyer suggested we start with a cease and desist and a formal demand for return of property, along with a trail leading from the attempted withdrawals back to specific accounts. She also advised me on the laws around the recordings. Some were clearly illegal to make without consent, and that gave us additional leverage. Meanwhile, I set a different machine in motion at work. I didn't go to my boss and say, "My family is trying to steal from me," because that's not a meeting anyone wants in the middle of a fiscal quarter. Instead, I used my influence the way I always used it, through data and process. There was a partner in my home country, a logistics firm that moved goods between small manufacturers and larger retailers. It was the same web of suppliers and buyers that my parents' social circle occasionally did business with, small companies that relied on favor and familiarity more than compliance. I began to dig, not to illicitly snoop, but to audit for process improvement, which is what I was paid to do. I asked my team to run a due diligence sweep on regional partners and supply chain intermediaries. The sweep flagged several red flags: poorly documented accounts, informal cash transfers, and a pattern of kickback-like payments hidden as consulting fees. Among those flagged partners was the very small company that Dad and Mom had always bragged about knowing. The one my dad had once mentioned over beers as doing all right, just the old way of doing business. I didn't rush that information to anyone. Instead, I quietly escalated compliance checks through the proper corporate channels. I requested formal audits, citing potential risk to our contracts. Those audits weren't personal at first. They were framed as risk mitigation for my employer. But once auditors started asking questions and accountants started requesting invoices and receipts, things stopped being cozy for anyone who was used to informal arrangements. At home, I watched the effect through messages and the way silence became a presence on my phone. Mom started calling less. I suspect because the bank had informed her father figure accounts were being investigated, and because the legal letter my lawyer had sent made it clear we were documenting everything. Ryan sent erratic messages, guilt-laden pleas one day, defiant wails the next, then long, odd text threads about how life had been hard. I didn't respond. I let them see the silence as part of the new reality. The best move, though, wasn't legal or corporate. It was social and intellectual. I reached out to one person, a senior executive at a company that had a minor stake in the partner firm, with a very carefully worded message. No accusation, no drama, just facts and ramifications. There are compliance irregularities that could affect your supply chain. If you want transparency, we can share the audit findings. I didn't need to threaten. I only had to show consequences were possible. The executive called me within the hour. The tone was one of professional concern. If these irregularities are true, we can't be associated with them, she said. We'll need to pause the partnership while we investigate. That was a domino that, once tipped, would cause others to fall. And they did. Vendors started asking for receipts. Buyers started postponing shipments pending verification. The small partner companies that operated on goodwill and little paperwork found themselves suddenly in the uncomfortable position of being asked for proof. It didn't take long before contracts that had been spoken for over coffee were put on hold pending formal review. For companies used to operating informally, this was devastating. For my parents' social circle, who relied on reputation and personal ties rather than rigorous accounting, it was humiliating and financially harmful. It felt strange watching it unfold. I didn't enjoy causing pain. What I enjoyed, what I cherished, was the methodical exposure of the structure that let them exploit me. Theirs had been an economy of favors and expectations. Mine was an economy of rules and evidence. Once the two met, the gaps showed themselves clearly. The real turning point, the part that felt like the beginning of the end, came when the landlord of the small commercial property where one of the partner companies operated called Dad. The landlord was concerned because payments were late and because bigger clients had paused shipments. He could no longer afford to keep the tenant on the same terms. Dad called Mom, who called Ryan. Panic spread through their texts like wildfire. I saw a voice note from Dad, panicked and shaky. We didn't expect this. Aaron, what do we do? It was almost comic the way the tables had turned. The man who had always suggested I was overreacting now sounded like someone clinging to a sinking raft. That was when I stopped being content with just making things right for myself. I started giving them choices, strict, inflexible choices, and I did it with a calmness that I had never used before. My lawyer drafted a condition. I would not report all evidence to authorities immediately if they agreed to return the money attempted to be withdrawn from my accounts, publicly acknowledge the privacy violations, and formally commit to never contacting me in a harassing manner again. If they refused, I would hand everything: the recordings, the bank logs, the documentation of the attempted withdrawals, and the emails showing collusion, to the police, to the bank's fraud department, and to the compliance teams at the companies affected. No drama, no theatrics, just options and consequences. I knew the social consequences would be harsh. I also knew they'd never expected me to take the route of documentation and process. They expected tears, apologies, and a begrudging return to the old dynamics. They hadn't accounted for the legal route or the corporate consequence route, and they certainly hadn't accounted for me operating calmly from 1,000 miles away. Their reaction was immediate and messy. Mom's messages shifted from pleas to bargaining. Ryan tried to call, and when I finally answered, not to argue, but to read him the terms, he hung up. Dad tried to appear reasonable. Son, we can talk. Let's fix this as a family. I read his plea and felt an old reflex flinch, but it didn't catch. The flinch didn't turn into action. The first deadline passed with silence. The second deadline was met with a frantic text from Mom asking for mercy and offering everything short of full confession. It was telling that the proposals were about saving face and not about true accountability, an attempt to buy a softer landing rather than to admit wrongdoing. I told my lawyer to record it and to insist on more concrete action. She recommended that before we agreed to any private settlement, we bring in a neutral third-party mediator to document everything under legal advisement. It was slow, it was procedural, and it burned them, in a way that bargaining and screaming never would have. And then came a moment I hadn't exactly anticipated but had secretly hoped for. I received an email from a regulatory compliance officer at one of the partner companies we'd audited. The subject line was short: findings and next steps. Attached was a careful report outlining questionable accounting practices, unauthorized transfers, and informal consulting contracts. The regulator had opened a formal inquiry. That meant that beyond the immediate bank and the landlord and the halted shipments, there was now an institutional trail forming that could expose long patterns of informal dealings. In short, things were beginning to unravel for others tied to my family's circle. When I told my lawyer, she smiled, not a spiteful smile, but a small, satisfied one. "You built a watertight case and gave them a single way to fix it quietly," she said. "They chose chaos. Now they'll have to face institutions that don't care about family narratives." Her words lodged in me like a lodestone. Institutions don't care about who is the favorite child or who deserves special treatment. Institutions care about evidence and compliance. That night, I slept with my phone on the table, but I wasn't waiting for guilt trips or pleas. I was waiting for the time when the pressure would build enough that they'd make a real mistake, something public, emotional, or vindictive. Those are the moments that would leave evidence behind in their own heat. I suspected one was coming. People who are backed into corners do unpredictable things. They lash out, and in the lashing out they leave traces. I had played my hand carefully so far. Bank, lawyer, corporate audits, regulatory nudge. It was working. The small world they'd relied on was fraying. Company leaders were asking uncomfortable questions. Landlords were calling for payments. And a pattern of informal transfers had a spotlight on it. But I knew the final pivot wouldn't be a technicality or a legal filing. It would be a human mistake. A call responded to in anger, a social media post made in a moment of frustration, an attempt to salvage dignity with a lie that could be disproven. And that's where I planned to sit, patient, ready, and utterly unmoved. I had no desire for cruelty. I wanted truth and accountability. I wanted them to stop expecting me to be their emotional and financial airbag. I wanted them to understand, finally, that choices have consequences. The first real spark came 2 nights later. A flurry of messages at midnight, a tone I could read in a single rhythm: panic. My lawyer called, voice low. "They've posted something online," she said. "It's defensive and it's public. They're trying to spin it as a family tragedy. But in doing so, they mentioned details that contradict earlier statements. It's sloppy." I opened my laptop and saw the post. A tearful video from Mom, shot in the kitchen, in which she accused me of abandoning family and blamed me for the livelihood of others. She cried, and she asked for empathy. It was painfully performative. But the slip was in a detail, a bank name, a transaction reference that contradicted what they'd told the landlord and what my bank had logged. It was the kind of small, human error that leaves tracks. I sent the clip to my lawyer. She typed back one sentence: "They just made it easier." I sat back, hands cold, and felt a small, strange calm. The stage was set. The systems were activated. The institutions were asking questions. And in their haste to control the narrative, they'd made the crucial mistake that would let the truth speak louder than their rehearsed lines. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I simply prepared the files, updated timelines, and made sure every document had a date, time, and source. I printed a clean folder and labeled it Evidence, Timeline. I knew when the right moment came, the narrative wouldn't be mine to shout. It would be the accumulation of evidence that would have its own logic and force. And that, more than anything, felt like justice. But as I closed my laptop, I realized something I hadn't quite accounted for. Once the institutional part of this moved forward, the fallout wouldn't be contained. It would ripple out in ways I could not fully predict. That unknown frightened me a little, not because I would regret the truth, but because consequences, even deserved ones, can be messy and painful in ways that touch people beyond the guilty parties. I took a breath, looked at my phone, and watched the clock tick closer to a deadline my lawyer had set. I had given them every chance to do the right thing quietly. They had not. I had put the pieces together with care, and now those pieces were aligning into something bigger than me. Then my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It was short and without preamble. "You broke us. We'll make you regret it." I read it twice, then 3 times. My stomach tightened, not from fear, but from the recognition that my actions had finally forced their hand. The rest, I knew, would be chaos. The next move would reveal everything, and it would force me to choose how far I was willing to let the truth go. I set the folder by the door and went to sleep, but sleep didn't come easily. The feeling wasn't triumph. It was the uneasy knowledge that once you open a door, you can't control who walks through. I had set the systems in motion. I had offered them choices. They had made others. The next morning, I woke up to 3 missed calls from my lawyer and an email from the landlord. The subject line read, "Immediate meeting requested." My heart thudded, not from guilt, but because the next chapter was beginning. I clicked the email with steady hands and read the first line. It said, "There's been a break-in at the property. CCTV footage shows unauthorized access." I stared at the screen. The files, the institutions, the quiet and methodical pressure, they had worked. But this was no longer a slow reveal. It was a sudden flare. I could feel the air change, like the moment before a storm breaks. I sat there, the reality of what would come next pressing against my ribs. I had planned for many outcomes, but the raw, immediate taste of escalation felt different. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a small voice whispered that revenge, even the smartest kind, always carries the risk of becoming larger than you intended. I closed my laptop and picked up my phone. There were 2 messages waiting, one from my lawyer, "Don't go to the property yet. Let us coordinate with police," and one from an unknown number, "You started this. Finish it." I put the phone down, breathed in, and felt the strange steadiness that had carried me this far. I had set the rules. Now the game had shifted. The next move was theirs, but the record, the timeline, the bank logs, the corporate audits, was in my folder. I was ready. And for the first time in a long while, I felt like I could see clearly through the chaos they'd created. And then my phone buzzed again, a notification from a news site in my hometown. The headline was truncated on my lock screen. My hands moved before my brain had fully warned me not to open it. I tapped it. The headline blared in a way I had feared and anticipated at once. "Local business under investigation after fraud allegations. Family ties to investigation revealed." My breath caught. My heart sped. I set the phone down slowly, aware that I had crossed the line from private retaliation to public consequence. The machinery I'd set in motion was turning, and now, whether I wanted it to or not, the world would watch. That's where I left it for now, standing on a ledge that looked like victory from one angle and like ruin from another. The next step would decide who fell and how badly. I sat there, clutching my coffee, folder on my lap, and realized that the calm I'd cultivated up to this point was about to be tested in a way I couldn't fully control. By the time the first official letters arrived, the panic in my family's messages had turned into a different animal, raw bargaining mixed with fear. Regulators froze accounts tied to the partner companies. The bank moved from investigation to formal casework and insisted on interviews. The landlord went to court for unpaid rent and recovered what he could through liens. The small world mom and dad had relied on favors, handshake deals, friendly nods, fractured under demands for invoices, signatures, and proof. Those things don't exist in the stories people tell at kitchen tables. They exist on paper, with dates and numbers and signatures. That's what I'd given the institutions, and institutions don't have patience for family narratives. Ryan's calls stopped first. Then they came in bursts, pleading voice notes, then angry messages, then the occasional thin attempt at guilt. He was forced to move out of mom and dad's house. The landlord demanded his name be removed from lease negotiations. A neighbor sent me a screenshot of a group text in which dad begged a former business contact for a private meeting, promising repayment and promising anything to keep the inquiry quiet. That contact replied with an 8-word message: "Lawyers already involved. We can't help." That was humiliation in the clearest form. There were consequences that looked bureaucratic and ugly, and there were consequences that were quieter but deeper. The auditors found irregular transfers and asked for explanations that couldn't be provided without admitting a pattern of intentional concealment. A preliminary compliance report flagged several transactions as potentially fraudulent. Companies paused contracts pending remediation. A few vendors lost clients. A landlord finally recovered some losses through legal channels. My parents faced fines. They were forced to issue a public statement, awkward, thin, and obviously crafted by counsel. promising to cooperate with investigators and to rectify any inadvertent errors. People in our town stopped inviting them to business lunches. The same neighbors who had once praised their generosity now asked awkward questions and kept their distance. Ryan's legal exposure was the hardest to watch. The recordings and the digital trail made it clear he'd accessed my accounts in ways that crossed legal lines. The police interviewed him. The bank filed reports that meant he could be charged with unauthorized access and attempted fraud. I didn't relish that possibility, but I also recognized that accountability had to land somewhere. When someone repeatedly weaponizes your life, consequences aren't cruelty, they're necessary boundaries with teeth. Mom's letters changed tone over the weeks. The "fix this" command became something less confident, written in sentences that asked for explanations I had no interest in giving. Dad called twice. The first call was a halting attempt at reconciliation that I let go to voicemail. The second was a brief, brittle apology that I returned with a single sentence. "There's nothing to fix between us until you mean what you say." He didn't call back. I could have taken the files public. I could have sought maximum legal punishment. Instead, after counsel and many sleepless nights, I opted for containment over spectacle. I handed the evidence to the authorities and to the appropriate corporate compliance teams, let the institutions do their work, and didn't feed the media circus. My lawyer negotiated restitution where it could be negotiated, insisted on documented apologies where they wouldn't be hollow, and made sure there were legal protections against further harassment. I wanted accountability, not revenge for revenge's sake. The fallout landed on them in different ways: financial strain, the collapse of reputations built on informal networks, and the quiet isolation of friends who no longer felt comfortable lending their names to shaky ventures. Ryan had to take responsibility for the most direct violations. Mom and Dad had to reckon with enabling and with the long-term damage to their credibility. None of it was pretty. None of it restored the years I'd spent cleaning up after them. But the imbalance corrected itself. For the first time, the default expectation that I would always be the fixer was broken. On my end, life quietly reassembled into something better. Work continued to give me purpose. I received a promotion 6 months in that broadened my remit and my compensation. I made new friends who never reduced me to family obligations. I found a rhythm that felt honest and earned. I stopped checking my phone at odd hours. The USB went into a safe deposit box I never opened except to make sure the seal was intact. I kept the folder labeled evidence, timeline not as a trophy, but as a reminder that I could document the truth when needed. There were nights when grief sneaked up on me, not for losses of money or status, but for the idea of family I'd once believed in. I mourned that version of my parents, the ones who had tucked me in and applauded my internships, not the ones who later rationed love like currency. I mourned the brother I had tried to teach and shelter and who chose manipulation over gratitude. But grief and relief can exist at once. I was older now, and my loyalty belonged to a life I had built, not to the weight of inherited expectation. They called a handful of times after the initial storm settled, voices thin and rehearsed, asking for meetings that would inevitably be performative. I declined. People often ask if I forgive them. I don't know if that's the right word. I don't feel the collapse of anger into gentleness. I feel closure. Closure is not forgetting. Closure is deciding you will no longer tolerate being the default caretaker for other people's recklessness. The last time I drove past the house where I grew up, months later, on a rare trip back to handle legal paperwork, I sat in the car and watched the curtains twitch as someone moved inside. I thought about the lunches, the expectations, the long string of just this once that had defined my 20s. I thought about the night I finally hit send on the acceptance email and how terrifying and freeing that was in equal measure. I unlocked the car, took a breath, and walked away without looking back. On my balcony in Singapore a few weeks later, with the city lights laid out like a promise below me, my phone buzzed once, a spam message, nothing more. I put it face down, sipped my tea, and felt the steady, unremarkable pulse of a life I had earned. They had asked me to fix something they'd broken. I did. The thing I fixed was not their messes. The thing I fixed was myself. I'm 42 years old, and this is going to sound unbelievable if you don't know my family. For years, I've been the one quietly handling my sister Marin's medical bills. Not because anyone asked me to, but because no one else would. I'm the eldest child of my parents, Nathan and Helen, and apparently that comes with the family ATM title in our house. Marin's illness first showed up almost 10 years ago, a complicated, chronic condition that required constant treatment, specialists, and surgeries. When it happened, Mom and Dad acted like it was a big inconvenience. They were busy running the family business and living their comfortable lives, so it fell on me to figure out how to pay for it all. I was making decent money then, and I told myself it was just what you do for family. At first, I didn't expect anything in return. I was just glad Marin was getting the care she needed. I covered every hospital visit, medication, physical therapy session, and special equipment. I handled insurance claims, copays, and even transportation when they couldn't be bothered. I never once made a fuss. But over the years, the quiet sacrifice became a glaring one-sided arrangement. Mom and Dad never thanked me. They never asked how I was managing. Instead, they acted like I was just naturally supposed to do it. And if Marin ever had a new need or emergency, they barely lifted a finger. It was always on me to sort out. My sister, caught up in her own struggles, was mostly unaware of the financial side. She trusted I was handling it. Then there was Jasper, my cousin. Jasper is the golden child of our extended family. Handsome, charismatic, always the center of attention. He lives out of state, rarely involved in day-to-day family stuff, and certainly never helped with Marin's bills. But he's the kind of person who knows how to talk his way into getting credit without doing the work. Last month, we had our big family reunion. It was the first one in 3 years, the kind of event where everyone wants to show off and remind the family who's really successful. I arrived early, nervous but hoping things would be normal. I hadn't told anyone I was the one paying Marin's medical bills. That was private. I wanted to keep it that way. But as the evening wore on, it became painfully clear that my role was being erased. Mom got up for a toast after dinner. She stood in front of the whole family, glass raised, and said, "Let's all thank our cousin Jasper for paying every penny of Marin's medical bills all these years. We wouldn't have made it without him." The room broke into polite applause. Jasper beamed, basking in the undeserved praise, and Dad clapped like a proud schoolboy. I sat frozen, the words catching in my throat. The realization hit me. They were happy to hand off all the credit to Jasper, someone who never lifted a finger. And me? I was invisible. I wanted to shout out, to correct them, but I couldn't. I watched as the narrative twisted in front of me, my years of sacrifice rewritten as a fairy tale about cousin Jasper's generosity. Everyone was looking at him, congratulating him with smiles and pats on the back. My parents, who should have been the first to recognize my efforts, were complicit in this lie. I left the reunion early, heart pounding. I needed space to think. How had my family, the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally, erased me like I was nothing? How long had this been going on behind my back? Over the next few days, I stewed in anger and disbelief. I wasn't sure whether to confront them or just walk away. Then, late one night, I made a decision. I sent a message to Mom, Dad, and Marin. In it, I told them that I was canceling all future payments for Marin's treatment. That if they wanted to thank Jasper, they could figure out how to get him to open his wallet, because I was done. After sending that message, I expected an immediate explosion, calls, texts, maybe even some tears from Marin. But nothing came. Just silence. The kind of silence that feels heavier than any argument. It was almost as if they were trying to pretend I never sent it, that I was some glitch in the system. But I knew better. I wasn't invisible anymore, not in my own eyes. I spent the next few days watching their behavior like a hawk. I checked my phone constantly, waiting for the inevitable. Mom was the first to break the silence. Or at least, she tried. A few days after my message, she called. But instead of the warmth I half hoped for, her voice was cold and clipped. "I think you're making a mistake, Grant." I didn't bother correcting her use of my first name. She always does that when she wants to sound serious. "Why, Mom?" Because I finally called out the truth. I kept my voice calm, though inside I was simmering. She sighed, like I was some petulant child throwing a tantrum. "You're making it about you again. This isn't fair to Marin. You think Jasper is going to step up now? He's not. You're just cutting her off." The nerve. Like I hadn't thought about that every single day. Like I hadn't felt the weight of every bill, every appointment, every late night spent figuring out how to make sure she got what she needed. Maybe if you and Dad hadn't spent years ignoring the problem, I wouldn't have had to carry it alone, I said, unable to hide the bitterness. Maybe if you'd ever acknowledged what I was doing, this wouldn't have happened. There was a pause. Then Mom's voice took on that venomous calm she always gets when she thinks she's winning. You're being dramatic. We're trying to keep the family peace here. Jasper handled things quietly on his end. I closed my eyes, swallowing hard. Mom, Jasper didn't handle anything. I did. She didn't respond. Instead, she hung up. That was the first of many cold shoulders. Meanwhile, at the family business, the one Dad's been running since he retired from his corporate job, word started spreading. I don't know who started it, but soon enough, I was the selfish brother who stopped supporting Marin, the black sheep who abandoned his family in their time of need. The people I once trusted now looked at me with suspicion, or worse, thinly veiled disdain. I tried to reach out to Marin directly, hoping she would understand. But her responses were carefully neutral, like she was reading from a script. I appreciate what you've done, Grant, but I think it's best if Mom and Dad handle things now. That stung more than any insult, like she was already siding with them. At the next family gathering, smaller, more tense, I watched the dynamics twist further. Mom took every opportunity to bring up Jasper's generosity again, as if repeating the lie would make it true. Dad, usually a quiet man, was more vocal than I'd ever seen. He casually dropped hints to other relatives about how Jasper saved us all, painting me as the irresponsible one. Jasper himself never said a word about the bills, but his smirk was constant, as if he owned the whole story now. The cousins who once greeted me warmly now greeted me with awkward nods or avoided me entirely. The family business employees whispered behind my back. It was as if I had been erased, and a new version of the story was replacing me. The breaking point came a week after the reunion, when I showed up unannounced at the hospital to accompany Marin to a routine checkup. I wanted to be there, not just as her financial backer, but as her brother. I found her in the waiting room, sitting with Mom and Jasper. Mom's smile was tight, almost rehearsed. Jasper barely glanced at me. Marin, can we talk for a minute? I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She looked at me like I was a stranger. Grant, maybe later. No, now, I said, stepping closer. I want to know what's going on. Why is everyone acting like Jasper's the one who paid for your treatment? Why did Mom make that toast? Mom interrupted, standing quickly. That's enough, Grant. You're making this about you again. We're doing what's best for Marin. I shook my head. No. What's best for Marin is the truth. What's best for Marin is knowing who really supported her. Jasper stood up too, his usual charming grin replaced with a cold glare. This isn't your fight anymore. Back off. I could see Marin's discomfort, but also her hesitation, torn between loyalty and the family pressure. In that moment, I realized I wasn't just fighting for money or recognition. I was fighting for my family's story, the version where I wasn't the invisible brother, the scapegoat, the villain. But the harder I pushed, the more they dug in. They weren't just ignoring me anymore. They were actively trying to rewrite history and paint me as the bad guy. I left the hospital that day feeling more isolated than ever. Since then, things have only escalated. The family business started excluding me from meetings, invitations to events stopped, and subtle digs turned into outright coldness when I tried to bring up Marin's care or finances. Even Marin began to distance herself, influenced by Mom and Dad's version of events and Jasper's quiet, persuasive presence. It's like they built a wall between us all, brick by brick. After that hospital confrontation, the family's behavior shifted from passive-aggressive to downright hostile. The subtle exclusions turned into calculated moves designed to isolate me completely. Invitations to family dinners stopped arriving. Calls from my parents and Marin became infrequent, their responses clipped and distant whenever I tried to discuss anything important. At the family business, the atmosphere was colder than ever. Dad, once a man who nodded politely at my opinions, now brushed past me in hallways without a word. Employees who used to greet me warmly now averted their eyes or whispered behind their hands. Even Jasper, who had rarely shown interest in the business, suddenly appeared at meetings, offering insightful suggestions that subtly undermined me. It wasn't just a personal attack, it was a power play, and I was the target. I began to watch closely, gathering information like a silent observer. The family wasn't just painting me as the villain in Marin's medical saga. They were rewriting every chapter of my life with them. The business was being reorganized without me. Assets shifted in ways that conveniently excluded my name, and financial decisions were made behind closed doors. One afternoon, I sat in the office of the family business, a place I had helped build from the ground up, and overheard a conversation between Dad and Jasper. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. I just happened to be nearby. Jasper was smug, leaning back in his chair. It's funny how easy it's been to push Grant out. No one doubts my involvement with Marin. Mom and Dad have sold the story perfectly. Dad chuckled, nodding. You've played your role well. The family's on your side. Grant's the outsider now. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I realized this was more than just hurt feelings. This was a calculated campaign to erase me completely. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, weighing my options. I had always been the peacemaker, the one who took the blame to keep the family from fracturing. But now, I saw that peace was just a mask for their manipulation. If I was going to fight back, I needed more than words. I needed leverage. That's when I started digging into the family business's financials. They were sloppy, too sloppy for such a long-standing operation. I uncovered a tangled web of questionable expenses, suspicious contracts awarded to Jasper's friends, and inflated invoices that funneled money away from the business's profits. I compiled everything carefully, making sure I had solid evidence. My parents had built their empire on shaky foundations, and their greed had left cracks I could exploit. I also reached out to a few key employees who had grown wary of the favoritism and corruption. They were hesitant at first, but frustrated enough to share insider information. Slowly, a picture emerged of a family business riddled with mismanagement and self-dealing, all orchestrated to sideline me and line Jasper's pockets. Meanwhile, I kept up appearances with Marin. Despite the cold distance between us, I still cared deeply. I sent her occasional messages, offering support without mentioning the growing storm behind the scenes. I didn't want to push her away, but I knew the longer I waited, the deeper her loyalty to Mom and Dad, and to Jasper, would root. The tension reached a boiling point when the family scheduled another reunion, this time at the business's annual shareholder meeting. It was supposed to be a celebration of the company's success, but I saw it as the perfect opportunity to expose the truth. In the weeks leading up to the meeting, I prepared meticulously. I printed copies of the financial irregularities, documented the nepotism and favoritism, and lined up allies among the employees and minor shareholders who had been kept in the dark. On the day of the meeting, the atmosphere was electric. The family was in full force, wearing their usual masks of charm and control. Jasper strutted in with the confidence of a man who believed he owned the place. Mom and Dad were perfectly poised, ready to defend their narrative. When the presentation started, I sat quietly, waiting for my moment. As the CEO began the usual corporate highlights, I requested the floor. The room fell silent. I'd like to address some concerns regarding the company's recent financial management, I said, voice steady despite the pounding in my chest. Specifically, issues involving contracts awarded under suspicious circumstances and financial discrepancies that have impacted the company's bottom line. A murmur spread through the room. Mom's face tightened. Dad's eyes flickered with unease. Jasper's confident smile faltered. I handed out the documents I had prepared, watching as shareholders and employees flipped through them. The evidence was damning. The favoritism was clear, the money trails undeniable. I believe these actions have been detrimental not only to the company, but to the family's reputation, I continued. And I think it's time we start being honest about who's truly running this business and who's been hiding behind false stories. The room exploded into chaos. Mom tried to speak over me, but the shareholders were demanding answers. Jasper grew defensive, lashing out with accusations and distractions. But I stayed focused. This was my moment to reclaim the truth, not just about the business, but about the years of lies and betrayal that had been forced on me. As the meeting ended, whispers of a formal investigation began. The family's carefully constructed facade was cracking, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was finally being seen. After the shareholder meeting exploded into chaos, the atmosphere around the family business changed almost overnight, but not in a way I would have hoped. At first glance, it seemed like I had lost the battle. My parents and Jasper moved quickly, unleashing their well-rehearsed arsenal of manipulation and control. They weren't just defending their turf. They were mounting a full-scale counterattack designed to isolate me, discredit my claims, and preserve their grip on the company and the family narrative. Almost immediately, they began circulating carefully worded letters and emails to the major shareholders, the board members, and the influential clients who had kept the company afloat for decades. These messages were polished and insidious, filled with phrases like family unity, preserving legacy, and warnings about internal conflicts that could destabilize the company's future. The subtext was clear. I was the troublemaker, the disloyal one trying to tear down what our family had built. Jasper, true to form, became the face of this campaign. His charm, which I'd always found shallow but effective, transformed into a calculated weapon. At shareholder dinners, industry mixers, and private conversations, he played the part of the concerned relative, the steady hand willing to guide the company through turbulent times. Behind closed doors, however, he worked hard to undermine me, casting doubt on my motives, questioning my credibility, and subtly threatening those who showed any sympathy toward me. The old guard in the family business, those who had grown up under my parents' wing and had been loyal for years, mostly stayed silent or sided with them out of habit or fear. But I noticed a shift among the younger shareholders and the newer employees, the ones who had less personal history with my parents and Jasper and who were more attuned to fairness and transparency. They began asking questions quietly, exchanging hushed conversations about the allegations I had raised. Some approached me discreetly, expressing frustration and support, but fearing retaliation if they spoke openly. It was a dangerous dance. The environment grew tense, with veiled warnings and awkward silences when I entered rooms. But beneath it all, a subtle but powerful momentum was building, a crack in the polished surface of my family's empire. I knew this fight was going to get dirty. It wasn't just about business profits anymore. It was about exposing a family that had, for years, manipulated everyone around them, taken credit for successes they didn't earn, and cast me as the villain for simply demanding recognition and honesty. The stakes were high, and the opposition was ruthless. Over the next several weeks, I gathered allies, a handful of concerned shareholders and loyal employees who had seen firsthand the nepotism, the inflated contracts, and the mismanagement that had quietly drained the company's resources. I hired legal counsel to assist in launching a formal financial and governance investigation. When the auditor's report finally came back, it was worse than I had expected. The evidence was undeniable. Misappropriation of funds, contracts funneled to Jasper's acquaintances at inflated prices, payroll irregularities, and blatant favoritism in promotions and bonuses. The report painted a picture of a family-run operation that had prioritized personal gain over the company's health and integrity. Faced with this mountain of proof, my parents tried to claw back control. They made a last-ditch offer, a settlement that included a buyout of my shares, a carefully worded public apology that would spin the story as a misunderstanding, and an agreement that I would cease all further claims or investigations. Jasper, ever the strategist, volunteered to step down temporarily from his executive position, framing it as a sacrifice for the good of the family. But I wasn't interested in quiet compromises. I wanted accountability, transparency, and for the truth to be acknowledged openly. No half measures, no smokescreens. My name had been dragged through the mud for years while they basked in unearned glory, and I refused to let that lie stand unchallenged. The fallout was swift and brutal. Local business journals and news outlets caught wind of the scandal, publishing stories that exposed the family's internal struggles and the questionable practices within the company. The public perception of the family shifted overnight, from respected business leaders to examples of greed and dysfunction. Longtime clients started pulling contracts, wary of the company's instability. Vendors began to reconsider partnerships, hesitant to get entangled in the drama. The business I had spent years helping to build was bleeding revenue and reputation. But amid the turmoil, I felt a sense of vindication. I was no longer the invisible brother, the scapegoat who had been blamed for any and every problem. I was the one who had stood up and said, "Enough," who had shone a light on corruption and deception. Marin, who had distanced herself from me during the height of the conflict, eventually reached out. Her messages were tentative, cautious. It was clear she was caught in the crossfire, torn between the parents she'd grown up with and the reality I was presenting. We talked slowly and carefully. I offered support, but I made it clear I wouldn't tolerate manipulation or lies anymore. Respect and honesty were the foundation for any relationship moving forward. In the months that followed, Mom and Dad retreated from public view in the business world. Their once unassailable influence crumbled as their actions came under scrutiny. They became shadows of their former selves, their control fractured and diminished. Jasper was forced to resign in disgrace, though he never truly apologized. Instead, he tried to salvage what pride he could, blaming everyone but himself for the downfall. As for me, I took a deliberate step back from the company to regroup. The emotional and mental toll had been significant, and I needed space to rebuild not just my career, but my sense of self. But I was no longer fighting in the shadows or swallowing my frustration. The family remains fractured, the rift too wide to bridge. I've accepted that reconciliation is unlikely, if not impossible. Their actions revealed who they really are, people willing to rewrite history, sacrifice relationships, and protect their own interests at any cost. But I am done being their victim. I've built a life on my own terms now, founded on truth and integrity. The scars of this battle remain, but so does the strength I gained by standing up to years of deceit. And in the end, that is the greatest revenge of all, not destruction or malice, but reclaiming my story and refusing to be silenced. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments. If you like this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content like this.